Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It's Thursday, March 28th, 2019. My name is Michael Brooks on a Michael Thursday, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. Joining us on today's program, Daniel Bessner, professor of international relations at the University of Washington, talking about his new piece in The Nation magazine, Foreign Policy Beyond Good and Evil, co-authored with Udi Greenberg, talking about charting a left humanitarian but also real-world-based foreign policy approach. A disaster relief bill hits a snag in the Senate. Democrats are pushing for greater assistance to Puerto Rico. Trump says they're already getting too much as food stamp hits hit the colonized island of Puerto Rico. Donald Trump has signed off on selling nuke technology to the Saudis in a major escalation of global security. A judge strikes down Medicaid work requirements in Arkansas and Kentucky. Good news for people there. What will be the counterattack? DOJ charges 18 members of a white supremacist prison gang as more and more information emerges on the Identity Europa fascist gang. The NRA officials sought Sandy Hook hoaxer to question Parkland shooting emails show. The nexus between the weapons cartel lobby and the conspiracy industry shown there. Theresa May tells MPs that she will be out after the UK is out of the European Union, but the UK crisis, austerity, and Brexit continues to deepen.
You seem to be a bit of a glum bucket.
She does seem to be a bit of a glum bucket. Actually, absolutely terrible and xenophobic, but I think we're going to have to give her fairly resilient. The Mitch McConnell, for some reason, keeps blocking the full Mueller report, which will obviously look totally great for Donald Trump and be totally awesome. Wonder why he wouldn't help his friend out more by letting everybody see the full exoneration. Majorities, incidentally, from both parties across all political lines want to see our report. Fact was literally used with our tax dollars on our behalf.
Yeah, the Republicans want to see it for different reasons.
Republicans want, right. Mike Pompeo is now backing out of even mouthing U.S. support for a two-state solution as Bibi escalates a neo-fascist authoritarian run for re-election in Israel, and Israel pummels Gaza, killing more Israeli civilians. President Maduro argues that it was a sniper rifle that took out Venezuela's hydroelectric dam. 187 Republicans vote against a bill to close the gender pay gap. And over 400 jurists and lawyers in Brazil sign a letter condemning the imprisonment of President Lula on baseless, corrupted, ridiculous charges. And President Bolsonaro sinks to record low approval ratings even as other machinations are afoot. All that and more on today's Majority Report. Well, everybody, as we said there's an election going on in Israel. And I should say it's Boys Thursday.
For the boys.
For the boys. Saturdays for working. I like how Trump's that is a funny part of Trump's self-concept that he's constantly working and he's like never worked a day in his life. But his sense of work is like, you yell at underlings, you have ridiculous phone calls, you golf, and then TV asks me about my arguments with other people on TV. There's an election campaign going on in Israel. And you can listen back a couple weeks ago with Juan Cole. There are actual disagreements inside Israeli politics on, as an example, spending, on deregulation. Israel, like everywhere else in the world, has gone through a sort of market deregulation, privatization process, oligarch wealth concentration process the past couple of decades that have hurt their social safety net, massively increased inequality, increased poverty, diminished job prospects, and also added to a much broader atmosphere of serious corruption and systemic corruption in Israel. Israel has a huge amount of corruption problems. The indictments against Bibi are not just about garden variety corruption, though. That's part of it. But it's also the leveraging of a free newspaper that was just funded and distributed freely by Sheldon Adelson, the American far-right casino magnate, and, you know, with a very, 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 very extreme views on Israel. And Netanyahu using that as a base to essentially try to extort press coverage, right? So these charges are also about a broader unwinding of, even inside 67 borders, Israel's institutions. No candidates that are in the race as of now with any serious chance of wielding power will do anything about the fact that Israel is an apartheid state, the fact that they control 5 million other human beings, the fact that there's rampant civilian abuses and killings, the fact that there's two different sets of laws in places like the West Bank. And the reality is politically that besides an occasional rocket attack, which of course should go without saying, but I feel like we do need to say it, of course we condemn, Israel is very secure. And there's no political price to be paid for this. And the modern consensus in Israel is really, I mean, there's some arguments about nation branding, and someone like Ehud Olmert will come out and still make noises about a two-state solution, but there's a huge amount of racism, there's a very right-wing political consensus, and there's a comfort in that situation. The joint list of Arab and socialist parties as of a couple weeks ago were not allowed to run, even as a Kahanist, which can literally be called at least actual Jewish terrorist adjacent political party, is running and in a broader right effort. So democracy in Israel is in bad shape, and the rights and justice for the Palestinian people remain at the bottom of the list of any kind of broader project. And you saw that in all of the racism and conspiracy theorizing and bloodlust at AIPAC. But this really drives the point home. This is an ad that is running in Israel right now. Everybody knows that Netanyahu and Trump are incredibly close. I would argue that they share a broader tendencies of the global far right. But there's also all sorts of specific synergies between people like Adelson, the Christian Zionist community, and Trump gave Bibi the Golan over a tweet, formalized an occupation, has supported every step of the way, killing civilians protesting in Gaza, Jerusalem's the capital, all the other things that we know, and also torturing, just generally. Pulling even basic funding from Palestinian institutions. Bibi is running on the race card again, just as he did in the last election when he did an emergency video warning people that Arabs were coming out to vote. Here is an ad. This is basically an excerpt from a Frontline documentary which shows Bibi just disrespecting President Obama to his face in the White House. And then there's reactions. It's clearly a Frontline documentary. So you have the clip, and then it's interspersed with journalists, and I think Ben Rhodes, who was obviously Obama's one of his foreign policy guys, basically just talking about how angry everybody in the White House was and how just sort of shockingly disrespectful this display was on a protocol level. the spin here, the twist, I should say, this is a campaign ad that Benjamin Netanyahu is running in Israel. So as he hugs Trump, the white supremacy president, he's literally running an ad which is just designed purely to showcase that I personally and directly disrespected America's first African-American president. And this is, by the way, Bibi's also was a prime minister during Clinton's presidency. So and there were conflicts with Clinton. In fact, Clinton sent his campaign strategist to advise Ehud Barak, or maybe not personally, but clearly Clinton wanted Netanyahu out. There is no equivalent of this kind of disrespect towards Bill Clinton, let alone, of course, the relationship he has with Netanyahu. Watch this. This is an ad running right now in Israel.
But this time, Bibi Netanyahu would lecture Barack Obama, taking a hard line on the peace process.
It's not going to happen. Everybody knows it's not going to happen. And I think it's time to tell the Palestinians forthrightly, it's not going to happen.
I've never seen a foreign leader speak to the president like that, and certainly not in public. And I've certainly never seen it happen in the Oval Office.
Israel obviously cannot be asked to negotiate with a government that is backed by the Palestinian version of Al-Qaeda.
You're watching President Obama there with his face in his hand, and you can tell it's not going over well. This is his house, and to be lectured in his office rankles.
It cannot go back to the 1967 lines, because these lines are indefensible.
Bill Daley's standing next to me, and he's going, outrageous, outrageous.
Netanyahu, Yamin.
And that is Netanyahu telling Barack Obama that even this process of a 2 states and 67 borders, which is already stunning, like for the Palestinians to accept that, they would have to accept, it's a given that hundreds of thousands of us were displaced. It's a given that we're not necessarily going to get financial restitution. And all of the 2-state solutions that were put on the table still were not sort of fully autonomous for the Palestinians. All sorts of questions about waterways and air travel and airspace. So that was Netanyahu just basically saying to Obama, like, hey, listen, get it. We're going to be an apartheid state. And even if I have to fake with you some type of pseudo 2-state solution, which he still mouthed, it won't be a real one. This happened, and I look, you can see Obama's rage, and by 2017, the Obama administration was at least ready to abstain on a resolution condemning settlement expansion, and that actually, of course, leads to the story of real and look, I don't want to say real because I don't want to get into this argument, but an actual case of collusion that we do know about and has been on the public record from 2017, which is Michael Flynn during the transition connecting to Russia, presumably others, at the behest of the Israelis to try to undermine Obama's policy of simply abstaining, not even voting for the resolution, but abstaining, which was significant. But now we have a whole other level of courage about this thugocracy with Ilhan Omar. And Netanyahu at AIPAC personally addressed her. And, again, this is in a context, obviously, with just a massive amount of racism and sexism and paranoia and bigotry and fear about Muslims, which is the meeting ground of Netanyahu and AIPAC and Trump and all of that. That's the nexus. It's certainly, if you think it's concerned about anti-Semitism, then I would like to take some time to figure out an internet scam I can list you in if I ever get time. This is what Netanyahu said to Ilhan Omar. And of course, he's referencing her "It's all about the Benjamins, baby" tweet of a couple weeks ago that people made a whole ridiculous melodrama about. From this Benjamin, it's not about the Benjamins. Undoubtedly, maybe a line written by his stupid son. And this led to Ilhan Omar, Yaz Queen. Dude, I am legitimately aggrieved that I will not be able to vote for this woman for president one day. She continues to impress and impress and impress. The sort of what would you call this emoji? This is like the kind of thinking face, sarcastic thinking face
scratching
emoji. Scratching chin emoji, which I actually have used to some decent effect myself. Not a big emoji guy, but I like this one. This one does a lot of work. She writes, This from a man facing indictment. Well, let me read it straight. This from a man facing indictments for bribery and other crimes in 3 separate public corruption affairs. Next. I don't have anything to add to that. Go contribute to her campaign.
Got it, finally.
Thank you. Go contribute to Ilhan Omar's campaign and make sure that any effort to undermine her, we beat back and destroy. We need her in Congress. We need her leadership. And we also need to protect her from the conspiracists and the hate mongers.
Yeah.
That's
definitely.
profoundly important. So, as always, props to her.
Yeah, her and her staff need to know that people got their back.
100%. And again, I'll be transparent. I've given 2 different $27 donations to Bernie. That feels great. In my estimation, we simply need him to be. That's just the obvious choice. I think I'm very transparent about that. And a couple of weeks ago, at the height of this, I went to her committee and chipped in $27, and that felt incredibly rewarding. So if I would just editorialize, I'd recommend everybody else do the same. One of the most important things we can do for our health every day is brushing our teeth, yet most of us don't do it properly. Did you guys know this?
I do, but only because I'm familiar with this copy.
Indeed. Or this excellent product.
I am personally familiar with this product. I used it this morning.
I'm not familiar. Tell me more.
Thank you, Brendan. Those are both very helpful bridges. Quip is a better electric toothbrush created by dentists and designers. Quip, and I'm a regular Quip user myself, totally convinced it's best in terms of brushing and travel.
Travels well.
Definitely. Quip was designed to make brushing your teeth more simple, affordable, and even enjoyable. With sensitive sonic vibrations, it's gentle on your sensitive gums. And the built-in 2-minute time pulses every 30 seconds to remind you when to switch sides and guide you to full and even clean. Because like your teeth are like like 4 quadrants, and what ideally you want 30 seconds on each area of the distribution. Well, the Quip times it for you, and you don't have to deal with a clunky charger, which I love. That means it's easy to travel, so you can keep up your great brushing routine when you're on the road. And it runs for 3 months on 1 charge. I love this toothbrush. I have certainly never in my life, and I don't think that this would surprise anybody, I'm not a product recommendation guy. I'm not somebody who finds I don't know, like a new cooking salt or something. Even if I do, it just doesn't occur to me. I'm not someone who shouts. I recommend books to people.
Yeah, you're not the gadget guy.
I'm not the gadget guy at all. I have recommended and purchased as a gift Quip for at least a couple of people in my life. It's an incredible, incredible convenience. That's why I love it. And that's why they're backed by over 20,000 dental professionals. Quip starts at just $25. And if you go to Quip, and if you go to getquip.com/majority right now, you get your first refill pack for free with a Quip electric toothbrush. That's your first refill pack free at getquip.com/majority. Getquip.com/majority. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Daniel Bessner. Welcome back to the Majority Report. Joining us now is Daniel Bessner. He's the Pyle Professor of American Foreign Policy at the University of Washington. He's the author of Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. He's also a regular, I must say, on the Michael Brooks Show. Daniel Bessner, thanks so much for joining the Majority Report. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me, Michael. Good, man. I'm doing good.
It's always a pleasure. So you took, first, why would you name a foreign policy piece after Nietzsche? That's like peak Bessner.
Basically, well, as you know, and probably many listeners do, authors don't actually come up with the names of these pieces, but it's the Nation's editors did. But I think it works pretty well. I mean, the basic claim being that we really need to stop thinking of foreign policy in these very stark, dualistic, or what might be termed Manichaean terms of good, of we're good and other people are evil, even if, of course, other people are, in fact, evil. It's not a useful way to think about what the United States should do in the world.
So you specifically, actually, you and your co-author, I should say, Udi Greenberg, lay out a pretty, you've got some pretty tough, you took the two, the progressive candidates, you took Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and you laid out actually some pretty hard critiques of them. We'll get to that in a second, but can you, before we do that, go to your kind of intellectual history roots? How did this notion, because it isn't just the neocons in Iraq, and it isn't just the new reporting on the sort of like Christian Armageddon agenda through Trump and Pompeo, I should say. There's a history, at least going back, I would assume, to the defense intellectuals that you chronicle after World War II, of this Manichaean worldview of American foreign policy. How did that develop, and how does that connect with, the reality of American foreign policy as a militaristic transactional empire?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. And to begin, one really has to recognize that for a long time, at least probably 6,000 to 7,000 years, anthropologists have discovered that societies have been defining themselves against an outside other, right? There's us, the community, and there's an other, and we are against them. So this is a very deep thing in human society and human civilization. But to bring it back up to a recent period, I think beginning really in the 1930s, when the United States and the North Atlantic countries, the UK and France in particular, began to confront Nazi Germany, what I would characterize as a truly evil state, like a state that was truly evil in its goals and in its leadership in particular, of course. Began to the countries of the North Atlantic began to define themselves against this other, this evil other, democracy versus fascism, and this became a rallying cry before World War II, when FDR was trying to get the nation to fight World War II, and then during the war itself. But then what happened, I think, is that after the war, this governing logic, this idea that the United States is good and its enemies are evil, began to be pushed from Nazi Germany and onto the Soviet Union. And of course, this is not to apologize for Stalin's many crimes, but I do think that the character of the Soviet regime, especially as we open up their archives and learn more and more about the decision-making process of the Soviet Union, it just wasn't the state that was as bent on destruction and domination as Nazi Germany we know was in fact bent on. Like, if you go to the Soviet archives, you could see how Stalin, kind of wanted to make peace after World War II and didn't necessarily want to fight a Cold War with the United States. And really, after Stalin's death, when Khrushchev took over, Nikita Khrushchev, he was certainly ready to make peace with the Soviet Union. But the reason that this didn't happen, I think, is that the United States began to view, during and after World War II, they began to view international politics as a realm of struggle between good and evil, where the United States was good and democratic and was spreading liberty and, of course, capitalism around the world, and the Soviet Union was its total mirror image opposite, other communist, totalitarian, and bent on world domination. And, of course, I think a lot of that view had a really important role in legitimating a lot of actions that American leaders themselves understood to be anti-democratic. So, for example, the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, which is very critical to understanding why Iranians hate the United States, the 1954 overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, the American support for the East German uprising in December of 1953. A lot of these actions, which were understood to be anti-democratic, were legitimated because the United States considered itself to be in a basically global existential struggle with the Soviet Union.
That's a really and so just and I want to just actually elaborate a little bit more, and I'm thinking of this now, so I don't remember this person's name, unfortunately. But I was at some event once where one of the speakers was basically some type of kind of like young and up and coming neocon, and what he was doing was trying to propagandize against Obama's Iran deal at the time. And it was incredible because, most of the arguments against the Iran deal were not most, but some of them were very technical. And you either could just dispel them technically, like, no, first of all, there's a lot of hype around Iran's program to begin with. We don't actually know what it is. And secondly, there is ways of monitoring and measuring it, or bringing in like ancillary issues, like, well, in fact, if you want to deal with long-range ballistic missiles or Hezbollah, actually establishing this deal could open a roadmap maybe to further diplomacy, whatever. But this guy's argument, I think, circles back to what you're saying, where he basically said, well, we know, Iran, and he had some, some examples, which were true, of the Iranian government, seriously abusing people. And he basically just said, well, if they treat their people like that internally, then we know they're untrustworthy externally. And, of course, the basic, one response, which has some merit, is like, whoa, okay, you want to talk about how we treat people internally. Let's talk about, I don't know, policing in the United States. Mass incarceration, right? But then the second point was actually like, that is ludicrous. And I think going back to the Stalin example, that's actually very good, right? Like, his crimes and his intention was to continue to go on to, run an increasingly horrifying and totalistic and murderous police state to consolidate power in the Soviet Union, and actually to keep on the sort of communist path, which is another kind of part of the interest of the scholarship, where it's like, well, actually there was some genuine commitment there too, which is interesting and disturbing, actually. But his foreign policy was very was actually pretty cautious and conservative, and he had already sort of climbed down from. Clearly, but when he made the initial peace pact with Hitler, the idea that this is going to be some global revolutionary force was already climbed down on. And even, one more thing to put in, one of the speculations around things like the Cultural Revolution is that in addition to consolidating Mao's power, it's the corollary of realizing that China isn't going to be as aggressive and as, in fomenting revolution. So there needs to be like internal disruption and recreation of that fervor. So it seems like that idea that we can correlate internal abuse with external behavior on things like an arms control treaty is really deep in like the American foreign policy psyche.
Absolutely. And I think it just highlights the difficulties of applying a particular type of morality to international affairs, because I think you and I know we agree, and I'm sure most people listening would agree, that the Stalin regime in the 40s and the 50s, and really the beginning with the purges in the 30s and the Moscow trials in the 36, 37, and Mao's Cultural Revolution are really terrible crimes against humanity in a real sense. They really, betray every leftist principle that I think one should advocate in favor of. But at the same time, the fact that this happens doesn't mean that the United States should commit itself to a half-a-century-long militaristic foreign policy where it's constantly intervening in other countries to avoid the specter of an expansive Soviet Union, or what people are trying to do today, an expansive People's Republic of China, right, which is now, for the first time in its modern history, really, truly expanding into the world, giving development aid to Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative, creating these basically what might be termed counter-hegemonic structures like the Asian Infrastructure Bank and its various development projects. But I think it's important to emphasize that the United States cannot, for even though its citizens may deplore these various internal actions, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to fight these existential global struggles, because what I think happens in the long run is that the United States winds up intervening, like in the cases I just mentioned in Guatemala, Iran, one might also add Chile, and a variety of other small actions, or in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, when if you go back and actually read what people were saying in the run-up to these various wars, particularly Iraq, was that they were literally comparing Saddam Hussein to Hitler and Iraq to Nazi Germany, which is basically an absurd historical comparison, but it serves as this legitimating function for basically never-ending U.S. militarism and U.S. wars abroad. So this is why basically you have to have two ideas in your head. You have to, criticize Stalin, criticize the People's Republic of China, while also being willing to say that we can't necessarily do anything about it. And that's really the tragedy of international relations. You could do certain things, work through international institutions, use diplomacy, et cetera. For example, I think you could use diplomacy to try to halt or at least alleviate the Chinese persecution of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But you can't really do much more than that, because the global effects of that, I think history have demonstrated, are really and truly terrible. So it's important, I think, going forward, and particularly for progressive candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and just to put my cards on the table, I'll support Bernie till my dying day. I think he's the only really legitimate candidate, and I very much support him. But what I was trying to do is try to I think it's important for the American public to be discussed with, or to not to be fed, but to use that language, to be fed a language that doesn't basically set international politics as a struggle between good and evil, because it's far more complicated than that. And that dichotomous Manichaean vision has done so much damage in the past, and I fear it could do an enormous amount of damage in the future. And just to complicate it a bit, I think Bernie has publicly been a little bit of two minds of this. So he does, I think, construct this dichotomous vision between a global authoritarian axis, and fair enough, there is a global authoritarian axis. But to frame that totally as evil and the United States is good is not necessarily the right thing to do. But Bernie also, I think, very correctly says that even if we disagree with what China is doing, we still need to deal with them to address climate change. We still need to deal with China to address global inequality. So Bernie, I think, is of two minds. And what I would do is just to emphasize the cooperative element, at least when you're talking about international relations, while also recognizing that the United States should do things at the UN or through various other global institutions to, for example, condemn the Chinese persecution of the Uyghurs.
I want to actually get really specifically to the problems and opportunities you see with Sanders and Warren. But I think there's one other thread I just want to put into this that I think is really important. There was a piece that came out several years ago by a guy named Paul Berman, who has had a lot of bad takes over the years, but it was a very interesting intellectual history of a guy named Yashka Fisher that I think Berman drew all of the wrong conclusions from. I mean, clearly he did, because I think he was at the time writing in favor of invading Iraq. So objectively, he did. Yashka Fisher, to make a long story short, was a German, like an actual German radical, like a guy who there's photos of him beating up a cop at a street protest. He would go on.
He transferred arms too, yeah.
Transferred arms, was at a conference in the Middle East with where the PLO was established. This was, I mean, when you talk about the European 60s and 70s radicals, it's like, sure, I guess there was some Weatherman people that blew themselves up or whatever. I mean, I don't want to minimize it. I know that some people got hurt and so on, but there were actual groups in Europe, and it clearly in many ways was actually a very failed and politically destructive effort. But just to be real, they were actually doing some actual guerrilla activity. And Yashka Fisher wasn't quite there, but he was adjacent. Anyways, he would go on to help found the Green Party. And then by the time he came to public consciousness in the aughts, in the late 90s, he's Germany's foreign minister, and he's actually leading Germany into its first external military engagement since the Nazi era. So there's a lot of wait, how does this hardcore left, anti-NATO, anti-Vietnam guy turn into a kind of pan-European liberal who supports humanitarian intervention? And one of the threads, and this is where I want to get to you, one of the threads that Berman argues is that in the early 80s, when Doctors Without Borders came around, the founders of Doctors Without Borders tapped into this idea that instead of these grand ideological narratives like getting rid of capitalism and so on, because they were coming from the left. They just want to go to places where people need help and help those people. And Berman was like, this is the great post-ideological turn. And then disastrously, he basically kind of correlated that sentiment with, the Bush administration waging an illegal war and, killing tons of people and upending the Middle East, which is a disaster and nonsense. But I wonder if we actually stopped that thought process into the disaster of kind of like liberal humanitarian interventionism, which is a massive problem, but actually went back to the more modest version of it. So that like if we looked at Syria, we realized like there might be diplomatic solutions that are really hard and really dissatisfying because it will involve any number of factions from Assad to rebels, and certainly Assad, I want to emphasize, who have an unbelievable amount of blood on their hands, but still retaining some power, right? But then on the other hand, all of the conversation about to intervene or not to intervene and all of this actually distracted from some really core points that everybody on the left should have embraced, like massively higher investment in refugees and humanitarian resettlement and areas like that like the whole globe has actually significantly dropped the ball on. And so when you talk about these other mechanisms, I mean, like concretely, is it a way of saying like, well, getting away from the disaster and military interventionism, what about like the U.S. commitment to full funding of, the UN Refugee Agency or whatever else that actually deals with the literal human cost of all of these policies instead of, by the way, of course, making them worse with our own military presence?
That's absolutely right. And I think it's important to highlight, since Woodrow Wilson, at least, so let's say for about a century, and I think it actually goes back further, the great hope of liberalism in an international context is that it will be able to manage international affairs in the ways you exactly described, that you'll be able to do things like, for example, precision strikes and just get the quote-unquote bad guys. And it's also to underline, like, it's kind of ridiculous that that's the language we use to talk about international politics, but bracket that for a second, or that you'll be able to use the military as some sort of precision force that could make the world safe for liberal humanitarian ideals. And I think that it's important for us to at least acknowledge the power of that claim, particularly before it proved to be false over and over and over again throughout the course of the 20th century. So I think what leftists could do and what leftist foreign policy thinking could bring to this entire discussion is to temper liberal dreams with historical realities. That even though, in an ideal world, one would be able to, stop the quote unquote bad guys and make the world safe for everyone, just history has shown that international politics just doesn't work that way. That the United States actually creates a lot more problems when it does things like militarily intervene in Libya, for example, or Iraq or Afghanistan, or the 149 countries our special forces were deployed in 2017, and that for this reason you really have to temper those liberal dreams with what I would call historical realities. But this isn't necessarily to advocate a questioned posture, right? I think that the United States is being the center of world power, and it still very much is the center of world power. I do not think it is in absolute decline, even though it is in relative decline. The center of world power and having an enormous amount of resources, I think the left could advocate a lot of clever solutions to global humanitarian crises, right? So let's say the United States is an enormously gigantic country. If anyone's ever driven through it, you see how much empty space there is. Why not actually resettle refugees here? Right. Why not use our massive resources to bring people who are being oppressed to the United States and actually contribute to the American fabric, as opposed to, trying to bomb the people who are oppressing them? Right. Why not work with foreign governments to do things like that? Why not, like you said, to fund the United Nations, or to fund basically maybe even think about creating new institutions that could perhaps be more effective to help refugee resettlement? Now, of course, listen, I think we all agree no one likes being deracinated, moving from their own cultural context to another, but in a tragic world, a world in which there are only imperfect solutions, I think bringing people here is better than trying to use the military to save them. The only problem is that the reality, the desires of liberal internationalism come up against the realities of American domestic xenophobia and racism. Right. So you have these things that are fundamentally in tension, and the liberal answer has been to basically not incorporate people into our own polity, people who could actually only make it stronger if you're a cosmopolitan like I am, but instead to try to use what is fundamentally an illiberal tool. The military and war are illiberal tools. So what they have tried to do, and I think this is the paradox of liberalism, liberal internationalism over the past 100 years, is to use the most illiberal tool for liberal ends. And I think this history has shown time and again that this is impossible.
Absolutely. All right. So you touched on it before, but Sanders and Warren, what are they doing wrong? What are they doing right?
So the difficulty is that the United States public is used to hearing about foreign policy in a particular idiom and has been used to hearing it for 70 years, which is essentially framing the United States as quote unquote good and our challengers as quote unquote bad. So I think that it's important to just contextualize Sanders and Warren, who very much grew up in the era of the Cold War and hearing this political language over and over again, this moralistic and Manichaean language. I think it's important to contextualize them. So it's not just this to be unthinking criticism, but just to appreciate the context in which they arrived. But what I think that they have done is that in some way basically reframed the Manichaean division of international affairs that began with the U.S. and Nazis and then continued with the U.S. and Soviet Union, and one might add continued with the U.S. and radical Islam, quote unquote radical Islam. It's basically a nonsense term that doesn't really mean anything, but basically for decades the United States has organized its foreign policy thinking in dichotomous terms. And I think, so let's take what Bernie said. He basically constructed, I think, a division of the world between, good democracies who actually care about liberty and what he called, I think it's, I forget the exact phrasing, but it's something like the global authoritarian kleptocratic axis consisting of like Russia, and sometimes I think he added China, and of course Brazil, which I would agree with all of these things. I think these places are global kleptocratic states. But the question is that does that language actually basically push progressives to adopt an interventionist foreign policy that, as it has in the past, underrates diplomacy and provokes the type of violent interventions that I do think have more negative outcomes in the long term and medium term. And Warren is basically the same thing, and I think Warren's actually a little worse on this than Bernie, I guess unsurprisingly, because she's a liberal in the way Bernie is not. But she claims that the very existence, or she has intimated at least in speeches, that the very existence of these types of kleptocratic pseudo-fascist states threaten and undermine American democracy, right? So if that's true, if these states, the very existence of these states necessarily undermines American democracy, then what can the solution be but try to overturn them or regime change, right? So this is the difficulty, because I think both Bernie and Warren are absolutely correct. Like, as you know, more better than most, Bolsonaro is a horrible fascist. Right. And he shouldn't be in power, and he's done a number of illegal actions, and he should absolutely not be in power. But the question is, if his very existence threatens democracy, particularly American democracy, does that mean that the United States should go in and overthrow him? The same could be said for Putin. The same could be said for Xi, and a lot of people are making the same claims about Maduro in Venezuela now, right? So it's a very, very complex and difficult situation. Right. And so it's a very, very complex and difficult situation where they are correctly identifying these states as bad actors, but by framing them as necessarily engaged in a Manichaean struggle with the United States, I think that it has the potential, if it's not, stopped or thought about in a different way, to go down the slippery slope towards some sort of interventionism. Whether it's military, it probably won't be, because I think Bernie has absolutely categorically rejected, as he should, military intervention. But even if it's something like sanctions, right? And as more and more research shows, sanctions actually have an enormously damaging effect on just normal people. For example, normal people in Iran, right? So if you're going to impose sanctions against Brazil, that's ordinary Brazilians who are going to really suffer from those sanctions. So the question is, how are you able to identify these bad actors as truly bad, which they are? I would like to underline they are truly bad, without necessarily retreating into this dichotomous and moralistic understanding of world affairs. And it's a very, very difficult task, particularly when, as the United States, you have such an enormous amount of power that you can really do what you want in the world. But I think these are the sorts of difficult questions that we on the left need to be thinking through right now if we truly want to transform not only our domestic, but also our international affairs.
I think there's some complications in Bernie that I want to elaborate on, good and bad, in a second. But before that, I mean, obviously, of course, I'm 100% Bernie. That's obvious and transparent, and it isn't just foreign. There's, domestic, the case he's making.
Oh, yeah.
But, it seemed to me like, on domestic stuff, what Warren is putting forward, other than this very weird equivocations on Medicare for all, she's putting together, in some cases, proposals that are the best of the Democratic field. Her foreign policy, particularly the way she's, pretty horrible on Israel stuff. Bernie was certainly the first person willing to at least even voice actual support, ironically, for what is official U.S. policy in terms of opposing occupation or even just acknowledging basic Palestinian humanity. Elizabeth Warren was right there with a Kamala Harris a couple years ago, and not even with a Beto O'Rourke, and it just kind of being like, whoa, like we're supposed to be 2019 Democrats. We can't exactly embrace an overt bigot like Netanyahu. But do you think, I guess that's like a preamble of like, what is she getting anything right in foreign policy? Like what is she bringing to the table in foreign policy that's distinct in a good way, or none?
I mean, she hasn't been particularly elaborated on this, but from my sense, I think Elizabeth Warren would be very good at sort of reconstructing the global financial architecture to be less welcoming to basically American multinational corporations who flee so many taxes in various tax havens, particularly in the Caribbean. That's what I think Elizabeth Warren would be best at, essentially her global economic policy. But my sense from all that I've read about her security and diplomatic policy, it's basically Cold War retreads in a very serious way, where she would, I think, promote a lot of the sort of interventionist policies that have defined democratic foreign policy really since Lyndon Johnson decided to escalate the war in Vietnam in 1964-65. So she's been, to me, a big disappointment on foreign policy, even though I think, like you said, she has been way ahead, ironically, or somewhat sadly, of many of the Democratic candidates in terms of advancing like particular technical policy solutions. Now, the question about the particular technical policy solutions, at least the question that I have, is that maybe this isn't the moment for the type of Brandeisian anti-monopoly politics of Elizabeth Warren, which essentially, as I view it, tries to save capitalism from itself. Right. But it might be actually the moment for Bernie Sanders, who just fundamentally rejects a lot of the institutions and doesn't think that necessarily that they could be made better, but needs to be replaced by new types of institutions that are more skeptical of fundamental capitalism. So this is I think this sort of Rob with it's good that she has these proposals, but is that necessarily what we want in the next president?
No, I mean, of course, I 100% agree with you. I was just curious to find, we're on the same page. But I do think, in foreign policy, in domestic policy, a lot of proposals are really good and intellectually demanding and really important.
For sure.
And in forein policy, it just, I don't see, like I read her, her fans were, you need to read her her foreign affairs essay. And it was like, right, I think that's correct. I think in the areas that we already know she's really good on, she definitely has a sense of things like the Panama Paper foreign policy, right? Like, and exactly. That's hugely important. But I agree with you. I don't think there's any evidence that on a whole slew of basic, hierarchical relationships built on faulty assumptions, let alone sort of horizon issues of, not indulging in, dangerous policy towards China as an example, or, rethinking how we deal with Africa. I just don't see it. But in Bernie, there's a funny contradiction that I see too, because I think on one hand, if you look at his career in the 80s, he had very much like he was a lefty. He was here's a Vermont shout out, even though he wasn't from there, but he is a Brattleboro Food Co-op foreign policy, right? Like this guy is
absolutely,
he's handing out the flyers. He wants to do, he's talking about how Reagan's backing all of these, murderous regimes across Latin and Central America. I'm sure that his feelings on Israel were much more complicated because, I just give a generational pass. That being said, he endorsed Jesse Jackson. He noted there's videos of him in the 80s saying that Palestinians need rights. That actually puts him well to the left of the dial. And then he gets into Congress. And again, I think, we got to credit where credit is due. The basic dividing line, he opposed the invasion of Iraq. That still is the most important, macro foreign policy decision in the last couple of decades, and he was 100% right on it. And then I think in other areas it was a combination of, his priorities really were domestic. That's also probably where he felt he could do some things. And I think in 2016 it was almost like he got reawakened, because I think that he kind of just put his head down and even sometimes went along with and voted for some very bad foreign policy ideas. And then in 2016, he kind of started with like, well, hey, I'm not a fan of Kissinger because I sort of like don't like war criminals. How about that? And then people were like, hey, that's great. What else you got? And he's like, well, while we're at it, I don't think Palestinians are subhuman and should get hit with white phosphorus every other day. And people are like, you know what? Sounds pretty good, man. What else you got? And then, in preparation for running for president, he brought on Matt Duss and so on. And he's been trying to synthesize. And I think, again, there is a global authoritarian axis, but that's also the kind of outreach to a sort of liberal view. But at the same time, in the same speech where he's talking about Bolsonaro, and obviously this would be something I would notice, he's certainly the only presidential candidate who recognizes, like, in the phrase, Lula's in jail under very questionable circumstances. Whereas I think, even just brand-wise, is Elizabeth Warren going to take on the process of being like, oh, well, there's sometimes just like fake nonsense corruption investigations that are political projects, not legal ones, and they're really dangerous. And it, belies a certain deeper skepticism. So I think that you're writing to both sides of Bernie's nature here. And, what's your sense of the team around him, of what way it breaks? And if it breaks the good way, is America ready for that? Like a real, just kind of more fundamental sort of, not anti-American, not a guy who's giving just, like anti-foreign policy diatribes in the White House, but somebody who's really like fundamentally is about diplomacy. And also I really acknowledge, just as a practical matter, the ways in which the United States is a major problem in world affairs. And I want to de-escalate those problems because ultimately they aren't beneficial to the American people.
I think those are great questions. So I think fundamentally I trust Bernie. I think he has good instincts. And I particularly, as you alluded to, trust people like Matt Duss who are around him, who have been really thinking about these issues for decades. And I have no doubt have basically agree with everything that we said. If I had to guess, I would say Matt Duss agrees with everything that we just said, and that Bernie could very quickly be convinced of it. And if he did sort of reaffirm these types of Cold War frameworks, it's probably just because more out of habit than any deep conviction to fighting existential wars with these various global authoritarian axes. I think he was, what I think ultimately is that he was trying to draw attention to what is truly a global problem, particularly as it relates to his major issue, which is domestic inequality, and how things like tax havens and kleptocracy abroad do affect American domestic politics at home. So I have no reticence whatsoever about supporting Bernie 110% because I trust the man. I think his instincts have long been correct. Foreign policy was not his major focus, but I think he could very clearly be convinced. And again, that's demonstrated by the team that he's hired, and the team that he's recently hired to run his campaign are people who basically agree with everything we just said. So I think Bernie, if elected, would be great on this. Now, the question I think of American receptivity to this is an interesting one and a difficult one, and I want to basically break it down into two issues. So on one hand, I think Americans are ready to reconceive of the United States' world role because unlike, let's say, in the period between 1945 and 1975, the majority of Americans do not benefit from the United States' prime position, right? They do not. The wages have stagnated, inequality is increased, and despite the fact that the United States has 800 bases abroad, the empire doesn't really do much to help them. So I think that in that sense, there's a material reality that Americans are like, what is this globe-spanning system of 800 bases, all of these aircraft carriers, all of these commands that essentially control the entire world? What is that doing for me? And particularly the fact that so many of our domestic resources are diverted to the military, with Trump asking for about $750 billion in military aid going forward, which is literally absurd in the world where the United States faces no peer competitors and basically no global challenges. Only the problems of international relations, particularly climate change and nuclear weapons, which to me are the one and two most important problems that we're facing, are basically problems that can only be solved through diplomacy, and the military could literally do nothing about them, and therefore we should basically ramp down our military budget dramatically. I would say get rid of $600 billion of it. Most people won't agree with that one, but at least we should get rid of a significant hundreds of billions. Well, I know you would, but significant hundreds of billions. And
but I'm the type of guy that thinks Henry Kissinger's a war criminal, so what do I know?
Exactly.
Right.
What do you know?
Right.
So basically refund the State Department. But the other problem is, and I think this is important, particularly, honestly, Michael, shows like this I think are really crucial in this effort. There is a cultural militarism in the United States that really began taking off in the 1940s and is now just absurd. The fact that military bands play at football games, the fact that all these military aircraft are always flown over football games, things like that, and various other sporting events. The fact that all of our video games are about basically fighting good wars, the incredible militaristic violence in American society is, I think, a major obstacle to having Americans rethink the role of the military in American society. And I think the question is, particularly for the left, particularly for cultural figures like yourself and shows like the Majority Report and the Michael Brooks Show, is what can they do to basically attenuate this cultural militarism, which is really informed and I would say infected many of the ways in which American rules the world. So you have the material reality where the military and the global basing system is not really benefiting the ordinary Americans, but you have the cultural reality where the military is basically the most valorized institution in American life. And this is actually a really difficult and complex situation. And so I think that's going to be a major issue going forward if people like Bernie, and I think he does, if people like Bernie want to reframe and rethink how the United States interacts abroad.
Final question. I just want to touch on China for a minute. Do you think it's possible that, and I'm setting a lot because even like what China's doing in Africa is actually, I just want to note, is an incredible process of sort of aggressive neo-imperialism. Belt and Road is very mixed and might yield some good things, but it's also, again, it's very environmentally damaging. And, I hate this idea of like a three-party proxy war in Africa between primarily the United States and China, but also like France trying to protect its basically uninterrupted colonial relationships there is very disturbing, and we'll talk about that more. But do you think it's possible to reorient the G2 China-U.S. relationship on basically like plenty of disputes and things to work out and so on, but we need to have a sort of global partnership on climate and a broader global environmental policy, which for all of their problems, China does appear to, at least on a policy level, take somewhat seriously. And if we had someone in the White House who wasn't just an insane sort of patron of oil interests, or in fact, even like a Democrat that accepted the science, but still is essentially just in the pocket of oil and gas industry, but somebody who actually comes in there and says, no, I get that this is the number one global emergency we face. Could that be the basis of a kind of productive partnership amidst other conflicts?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question. So the way that I view it is, in 50 years, the United States will almost certainly not be in the Eastern Hemisphere in the way that it has been, right? So now a lot of people disagree with that. Some people really are committed to maintaining the U.S. presence in the Eastern Hemisphere, in the South China Sea, in East Asia, et cetera. But if one believes, as I do, that the United States, that China is basically simply too big, simply too powerful, and simply too interested in maintaining dominance of its region, just like the United States has for centuries, in the very bad ways, I might add, maintained dominance of the Western Hemisphere, I don't think it's fair to think that the United States will still be in East Asia in the way that it has been for decades at this point. So to my issue, to my view, rather, the way to foster Chinese-U.S. cooperation, which I agree is absolutely central to basically fighting climate change, most importantly, but also, contributing to nuclear demilitarization, et cetera, the way to do that is for the United States to recognize that it needs to start drawing down in East Asia and what that means for our allies, right? What is it going to mean for Japan, South Korea, and the other nations?
And Taiwan. I worry for Taiwan.
Yeah.
I worry for Taiwan a lot.
It's really difficult. It's really difficult because I don't think the United States is going to fight World War III over any of those countries. Right. So the issue is, how do you basically negotiate some sort of security transition in East Asia that enables places like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan to maintain some sort of sovereign independence in the face of an enormous China, while also not antagonizing China needlessly, particularly when we need to cooperate with them over with issues like climate change. So I think this is basically the great question of the next 25 to 50 years of American diplomacy. How could you essentially do that? And basically, do you do that in a way that where you have a type of ring of containment from Japan to Taiwan to Australia, one might add, that tries to quote unquote contain China, or do you develop some sort of true global architecture where there are basically accepted spheres of influence for particular countries? And I might add, these are all imperfect solutions, but in an imperfect, tragic world of international relations, I think you're choosing really between imperfect solutions. And the way to foster peace and the way to combat climate change is for the United States to recognize that it's not going to be able to have the influence that it has long had in East Asia, and to begin a process of drawing down in the region that at the same time doesn't just totally abandon our allies to the Chinese rise.
Perfect. I just want to spitball an idea. I'm wondering if we could organize a debate between you and Samantha Power, but here's the twist. It's moderated by Sebastian Gorka, and he calls both of you cucks.
That is extremely hot.
Daniel Bessner, I appreciate your time as always. The Peace in the Nation, Foreign Policy Beyond Good and Evil, co-authored with Udi Greenberg. Read it. It's a great piece. Read everything Daniel does, particularly Hans Speyer, The Rise of the Defense Intellectuals. I mean, that book is actually like, if you're just really even interested in just a kind of filter of understanding like post-World War II America, it's a well-written, great history. Daniel, thanks a million as always. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Michael. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks, man. All right, folks, become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. Less than a cup of coffee a day. Go to justcoffee.coop, get your fair trade tea, coffee, or chocolate. That's such an awesome company. Subscribe, spread the word, like, review, all of that good stuff. Do the same thing with the Michael Brooks Show. Become a patron at patreon.com/TMBS. This last show, we had on Francesca Ferrantini to talk about AIPAC, Matt Taibbi to talk about the media failure of Russiagate, and on this Sunday, an illicit history of redlining and a case for reparations with Marissa Barara-Darin. Patreon.com/TMBS, and all sorts of clips at Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. Matt.
Literary Hangover. Next episode's going to be the first Saturday in the next month, but the King Phillips War episode is still up there. If you're not subscribed on YouTube, subscribe, because that is going to get monetized soon, and I might start doing some more stuff on that, like actual video stuff, but we'll see.
It's a good idea.
Also check out Antifada. Check
out the Antifada.
We have a new. Well, you've heard the song before, but now Bullprog has done a
Bullprog is quite talented.
Yeah, very all-around media producer.
This is a talented person. Check this out. See you in the fun half.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 eighths. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Ooh.
Rand Paul. I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're not paying.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good.
Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook.
Throw our hands up.
Ooh.
Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
Wow. That is like all
Great
of these
job.
things incredibly impressive and terrifying. I feel like watching the next one now. Like honestly, can you just give me a dose of the Dave Rubin one?
I saw your subreddit and they seemed
just give me
sort
a
of
dose.
angry. I don't know.
Well, I don't even want to get into that. They were. That wasn't my own thing. All right, whatever.
Really?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Hey, Dave, this is a very brave move on your part. Kudos. Have you heard about the SJW nonsense on the...
Dave Rubin is going to absolutely need to be exposed.
look, I encourage all of you to go fan trolling of Dave Rubin.
Competition would start kicking in.
There was a video, and then there was like 14 videos. So a lot of people made mixes of this.
You know what? I'm Our just watching the friends, whole thing. creative, awesome people on YouTube. It's basically everybody.
We got a ton. And here's another. Debate Sam Seder. Debate Sam Seder.
Why don't you just run to your safe space, Dave?
Debate Sam Seder. Debate Sam Seder. Fucked up again. Damn it. I just want to say, Dave, I do respect you.
It's going to be good, folks.
Not.
How can you say that?
It's funny.
Jesus.
Yeah. Left is best.
All right. Who's laughing now, Sam?
Just a reminder, it is your support that makes the show possible. Does not get less mature than this, folks.
Jesus Christ. Bullprog is a fucking genius. Wow. That is, I don't even know how to describe that. That's incredibly
Subscribe
funny.
to Bullprog.
Definitely subscribe to Bullprog. Wow. Seriously, kudos. That's incredibly funny. You're calling from a 925 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Michael, this is the Monocle from the Discord chat.
Hey, the Monocle from the TMBS Discord. How are you? What's going on? What's on your mind?
Very, very good. I was just calling in because I was listening to your conversation with Daniel Bessner, and I had a couple questions for you. And obviously, it would be great if Daniel could answer them since he was the one talking about them, but
Yes.
you seem as up to speed as he does about these issues, so
Okay, I'll give it my best shot.
hopefully it'll work. All right, so first, I'm kind of curious, like, the concept of taking in refugees as opposed to intervening when it comes to, like, genocide or, like, mass, like, grave human rights violations instances. I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you reckon with the incentives that you build when you do that? Like, let's say you just say, we're going to take all 11 million Uyghurs, first of all, as if China is going to allow you to just take their 11 million Uyghurs. But let's say you do that.
Okay, but can we stick with an example that's like more plausible? Because we were talking about we could definitely do way more for Syrian refugees. So the approach he was talking about with China and the Uyghurs would definitely be like diplomacy and advocacy, right? So let's stick with an example where it actually applies, like humanitarian intervention in a place like Libya or Syria versus doing way more for refugees and documenting crimes or other non-military lethal means. Let's stick with a real example, because I think in China we both know it's like, yes, they're not going to release 11 million Uyghurs, and we're also, I mean, actually, some people do want to militarily engage with China, and I think both you and I would agree that that's absolutely insane. So let's focus on, examples that make sense for what we were talking about.
Yeah. So okay. So I brought up the Uyghur thing because he explicitly brought up the Uyghur thing when he was talking about this context. But okay, we'll move on from that.
Yeah, but I think he's.
Okay,
I know that he's not talking about. He's certainly not saying that they would release 11 million people. But anyways, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say any instance. Okay, let's say even in small areas like Rwanda, etc.
Okay.
Like any instance in which there's a genocide going on, right? And there's not an implicit threat that a country is going to intervene. Now, I'm not saying America's that country that has done that has any intention to do that. That's not the way the country is set up. The country's intention is not to go around stopping genocide. The country's intention is to go around making money for a select class of people in the country. But obviously, we're talking about all these things in the context that we have won and we have power in the country, because we're talking about Bernie Sanders unraveling U.S. empire, which is not something he's going to do with a tenuous relationship with the Democrat Party after he just won the presidential election. I'm assuming this is in the instance magically that socialists are having a dominant position in American governance.
Well, actually, I don't agree with that presupposition, because I actually think he's going to have actually. I mean, I'm not saying he'll do it, and not Daniel and I don't. It's going to be unbelievably hard, but actually, Democratic presidents period have more power, frankly, over foreign policy than they do over domestic. So he actually could go in there and, frankly, use the executive branch to do quite a bit. So actually, I don't agree with that. But anyway, let's get to the specific of
I would be curious to see the way Congress reasserts its ability to control those issues.
Well, that's an interesting hypothetical. Give me the question. Give me that question, please.
What I'm saying is that if you are basically taking a policy position, which, by the way, is politically unpopular at home, the idea that we're just going to take refugees from everywhere. We do have a racist country that is.
So the question is,
it's a very hard sell.
The question
is, how
is,
do you reckon with those issues? Like you wanna build a political platform based on this particular set of policy prescriptions. How does Bernie Sanders go out there and sell that to the American people?
Well, I mean, first of all, again, I don't want to I think, let's not fixate too much on the one example of him saying that we could bring, he's not saying literally to bring in 11 million Uyghurs as an example. He's saying that certainly we could bring more. I'll answer. Let me just. I'll give my best shot. So because I just want to set the proper parameters. So I'm sure everybody agrees on any sort of left that we should take in more than a couple of thousand or none Syrian refugees, right? So there is a big wide difference between 12 million people and even frankly 1 million versus 10,000. And this is interesting to me because I think I would assume that you're somebody who is obviously a harsh critic of ICE policies and of various other forms of weaponized xenophobia. And I think this is these are always the dual paradoxes. If you're running a cosmopolitan socialist politics, whatever you want to call it, you can absolutely run successfully on the economic issues because that's where most people actually are. I think most people actually are with us on the economic issues or are very easily persuadable. And on the flip side, you're going to have to sometimes take on unpopular causes of fighting various forms of prejudices and hope that the country will come along with you. So same principle applies. But even there, I mean, again, when we talk about funding new international agencies or UN refugee agency, this could also be as simple as significantly upgrading the conditions in Turkey or Jordan or any number of other places. The point is resetting the conversation to deal with humanitarian needs instead of indulging in humanitarian interventions, which have in the main turned out to be absolutely disastrous. Now, every time you have these conversations, people can always, I think this is where it's important, where it's we're not lawyers. We're trying to think out big pictures. So anybody on any issue, and I'm seeing this frankly, you can always find, I know there are people in Kosovo who will say that Clinton's and NATO's intervention there saved their lives and their families. I totally believe them, take their word for it, 100%. I respect that. But I also know that that intervention had bigger structural problems, right, than that one benefit, which was significant. And so that's hard. Conversely, in Libya, again, some people feel the need to whitewash Gaddafi. I never would. But also, and he was absolutely tyrannical and murderous, and did hire paramilitaries and was doing door-to-door operations. And it was really horrific. And guess what? Our intervention there was an absolute disaster, just as it was in Iraq, just as it was in, to the extent, even just in Syria, which has actually been greatly exaggerated by some people, we've killed a ton. We've killed thousands of civilians, even just with the air campaign. So this approach does not work. And the argument is we need to rethink it on a policy level. And I would assume that anybody on good faith on the left would say that, just like as in any other issue where maybe there's a prejudice in the country, we're going to fight it. I mean, I thought that was the approach.
I would agree.
General.
Also, I would add that even when these things succeed,
Right.
let's say we go into Syria and we save the Kurds and we invade and we use like the full weight of our ground troops and airstrikes and everything we can to just get rid of Assad, get rid of ISIS, everything, and just set up a free Syrian area. Well, I mean, ultimately there's 50, 60, 70,000 hardcore Islamist terrorists fighters over there, but there's also millions of Sunni Arabs, and those Sunni Arabs don't necessarily have shit to do with ISIS and are just stuck. They're just trapped in a situation they don't want to be in.
No
Now,
doubt.
it's easy for people to ethnically divide all this stuff up, but the reality is most people don't have shit to do with shit. They have no power, they have no influence, and they're just
100%.
stuck living with their surroundings.
Of course.
And any instance where we do the good thing where we would go in and save the Kurds also means maybe we'll kill 100, 200,000 Sunni Arabs that had nothing to do with anything. So it's
and I want to say though, because some people will say,
kill people, you know what I mean?
I agree with you, and I know some people are going to say that I'm being contradictory because I do support leaving the forces in there that are already there, supporting those Kurdish areas. I do support that, and I'll get to this in a second. But it's frankly for the same reason, and I think no one can. I mean, the whole Russia story aside, I've been somebody who's criticized Putin and Russian foreign policy for the whole time I've done this. I'm glad that Russia's sending troops to Venezuela for the pure fact that is potentially a de-escalation of what Trump is trying to do there. So there's also another element of just working with the materials you have in a non-ideological way, in a smart sense, right? There's never non-ideology. The baseline ideology is anti-imperialist, anti-interventionist, and about addressing inequality and guarding rights to the extent that's humanly possible, but not having a rigid rule one way or another. And sometimes it's in this particular configuration, U.S. troops there are helping and important and will protect, stop a greater evil, Turkey going in and ethnically cleansing and destroying these very worthwhile experiments and also just killing a lot of people. And then on the other hand, if Russia or China, both of whom have their own abominable foreign policies, disrupt the complete U.S. reassertion of a hegemonic far-right turn across Latin America, then that's also good. And incidentally, you can add to the case that this, again, as always, does not mean that I'm a big fan or supporter or whatever Maduro. This is just the critical context, right? And I think that broader frame, that you can't look at this in moralistic terms. You have to have ethics, but you can't be a moralist. I think it actually is almost true across the board, but it's particularly true in foreign policy. I really appreciate the call, man. Thank you so much, and it was good to hear from you. Let's actually play this sound. Donald Trump hosted Juan Guaido, who is just declared himself president of Venezuela and now is recognized as such by Canada, the United States, European countries, other Brazil under the fascist Bolsonaro, the far-right Colombian government. Basically, countries that are still pushing for an illegal regime change or a coup. His wife was at the White House, and Trump, it's funny, it's rambling, it's nonsense, but then there's a specific response. Russia has deployed, I think, about a couple hundred troops in Venezuela. They I don't think it's a main foreign policy priority for Russia. It's not like Syria. Syria is definitely a main priority for them. But they have a relationship with Maduro, and they clearly see an opportunity to create at least a little bit of indigestion and heartburn for the United States. Trump's response to that is it's verbally tough.
We are with Venezuela. We are with your husband, as you know, and you're with the people that he represents, which is a big...
Pause it. The white people of Venezuela and the oligarchs and the oil interests, yes.
Big majority of the country. What's happening there should not happen and be allowed to happen anywhere. So we're with you 100%. Okay? Please give my regards. It'll all work out. It's all going to work out. It always does. We're going to get it to work out. Thank you very much. It'll be fine. Steve?
Mr. President, what sort of complications does the Russian involvement now pose?
Russia has to get out. All right, what's your next question?
So let me restate my point, and I really want people to understand this. When people who have a Manichaean view of the world, which is purely U.S. centric, there's no other problems on the planet besides the United States. It's one thing if you say, as Noam Chomsky does, that your primary obligation is to deal with the United States because A, you live here, or B, it's the prime superpower. Those are valid, I actually think mostly correct arguments. But if the third option is the United States does all these horrible things and China's just beautiful, benign interest in Africa, they're not bioprospecting. They're not, taking over economies and countries and destroying environments and abusing labor rights. They're great. Or, no, Russia just wants this enlightened multilateral world. That is ridiculous. And it keeps you from saying, as an example, in the Kurdish case, there is a small group of U.S. troops. Why would you pull them out just on a pure ideological principle, sell out the Kurds, and open the door for even more Turkish ethnic cleansing? Again, the comment of Turkish ethnic cleansing is based on what happened in Afrin, where they actually went in and did it, because in that case, the Russians betrayed a group of Kurds. And Turkish foreign policymakers saying we're going to go gutter to gutter, to paraphrase, to get rid of these people, okay? Now, conversely, great. I'm glad Russia's going to Venezuela. Because, you see, I don't want U.S. imperialism there. My prime orientation is anti-imperialist, and that is primarily United States, because the United States is the prime superpower and imperialist, and I'm an American. But I don't want a world that is, to the extent it is humanly possible, clustered under the corporate or state hegemonic umbrella of anyone. It's abusive, it's profoundly unjust, and it also tends to be antithetical to really important political experiments, whether the Kurds or, still yes, in some respects, the Bolivarian government. So understand that distinction and reassess your actual strategy and understanding of how power works. The other thing I just want to add is an addendum, and I think we might need some sound for this, which I don't know if you have ready, Matt. A certain, there's a music, maybe. Oh, sorry. What I'm about to say about the other aspect of this video, which is that, and this I don't want to lead with this, and I definitely don't want to talk about the Russian investigation. Everybody's annoying me. But Trump said, Russia, get out. But in the beginning, he said, everything is going to work out. Now, if you rearrange the words in that segment, he's saying Russia will work it out. And that should concern you. I'm Rachel Maddow. Bullprog. News of the NRA has been... Wait, is that the Bullprog?
The very same.
Wow. Respect. News on the NRA has been nuts lately. Enlisted Sandy Hook truther to sow doubt about Parkland shooting. Help racist groups in Australia. Blocking Violence Against Women Act. Former director tied to Identity Europa. Oh, thanks for the props. Love you guys. Well, we love you back. And yeah, The NRA is a weapons cartel lobbyist that has actually, its bread and butter has been white identity politics and stoking paranoia of a race war for ages.
That would be a good show topic. We should maybe look for somebody to do an NRA wrap-up.
Good idea.
Because I'm always, my bias is to look for the domestic anti-democracy organizations.
I think that might be a bit more useful. PGIF. Hey guys, could you have someone on to talk about the influence of religious values in today's society? The right always talks about so-called Judeo-Christian values, even though it is clear every day that we really live in a society with values centered on capitalism and neoliberalism, which are somewhat incompatible with Judeo-Christian philosophy. I really think that this was just Islamophobic dog whistling, and I'm getting pissed every time Ben Shapiro or even Dave Rubin talk about it. Love the show, left is best. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And again, I think that it's one of the things that was so bad about new atheism as a discourse, and please understand that this is not...
This is an attack on individual people that don't believe in God.
Indeed. And even though I don't identify as an atheist, which I understand still triggers some people, especially when I'm reading this book, I get a sense of like who a lot of my prime intellectual influences are, even if I wasn't conscious. And Cornel West is a Christian, calls himself a Christian socialist, so he is religious, and he's probably the person I admire most. But, I don't know, Marx, Adolf Reed, I mean, atheists are great, is the point. And critical...
Do a lot of good work.
Atheists have done a lot of tremendous work, which more and more people are noticing. And the historical task of atheism to actually explain how religious narratives track other societal political hierarchies or block the inquiries and discoveries of science is not only correct, but like noble. But the new atheist narrative that was basically a proxy for anti-Muslim politics and Western chauvinism and was also so just empirically inaccurate about religion. And this is an anthropological statement. Again, I don't care. Believe whatever the hell you believe. But the notion that you cannot understand that there is not one version of Christianity, there's not one version of Buddhism, there is not one version of Islam. This is both literally true geographically in terms of how these things change from country to country and culture to culture, but in terms of the ideology that they promote. And I want to give Cory Booker some props here, because the reality is that even though things are changing, particularly in certain parts of the country, candidates are still going to have to pay their respects to religion. And a lot of people also, again, I tend to take people at their word. I remember Christopher Hitchens did a lot of like, I secretly think Obama's an atheist. I don't know why I'm doing a Gorka for him, but it was like, I don't know, Chris, like I get that that's your way of complimenting him, but Barack Obama says he's a Christian. So I tend to go with what people say about themselves, right? So I think Cory Booker is a religious person. I don't even know if he's actually necessarily... I thought he almost seemed more like kind of like general New Age guy, but maybe he identifies as a Christian. I don't even mean that as an insult. I mean he's a positive quotes guy. But this answer on what religion means in public life, I will never support Cory Booker, all the usual problems with him, blah blah blah. Let's index those. If more people could answer this question like this would do a lot of good in our society.
I am a pastor here in town, and in my faith tradition, we keep partisan politics out of the pulpit.
Yes, sir.
But as a citizen and a person of faith, I do have my own opinions. And I find President Trump's whole demeanor and most of his policies to be abhorrent, or should be, to persons of faith. So I would like to ask you, can you share with us how your own faith would influence you as president?
God, thank you for that question. So I just want to say up front that I'm a person that often says that before you tell me about your religion, show it to me in how you treat other people.
Pause it. And frankly, before you tell me about your atheism, show me how you treat other people.
I was raised in a church where my mom taught Sunday school, and I'll never forget learning that verse, that faith without works is dead. And I'll tell you what, I feel like I'm in church right now. And I'll tell you what, this is what often bothers. I would rather hang out with a nice atheist than a mean Christian any day of the week. And so So thank you for asking me about my faith. You asked and I will share. The foundation of my life was a raising with a faith in God. But I was taught that faith demands first and foremost humility before God. That you look at your brother and sister, regardless of their faith, regardless of their background, with a conviction of love. Love thy neighbor. And love is not easy. And it really bothers me that when folks think that being loving or kind, I tell you, to be strong, you don't need to be cruel. To be tough, you don't need to be mean.
It's great. And that's exactly right. And I mean, and look at anybody, just as a very basic example. Do you think Pat Robertson and Desmond Tutu are doing the same thing? Again, and again, you can have a broader objection to religion. That's fine. In some cases, again, even heroic. But if you can just reduce that either to, well, it's all Christianity and it's all false, or even just do kind of like mental gymnastics. Christopher Hitchens had a great, excellent debate line that was also totally empty and vacuous, where he would say, I respect Dr. King enough to say that he would be like a great leader even if he wasn't a Christian. The only problem was that he was a Christian, and his entire intellectual infrastructure, as well as the physical base of his social movement, was in the black church in the South. And then it was a interfaith coalition with people like Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of my heroes, that did the actual work. And then his intellectual infrastructure, because King was, in fact, as we forget many things about him, in addition to being a shrewd strategist and a political radical, was an intellectual, was a Christian intellectual with secular but also Gandhian and Eastern influences. So I'm not going to do a counter thought experiment, which is like, hey, if Martin Luther King wasn't a Christian, he would be a terrible person.
He wouldn't have had the prominence and the acceptance from media that he got.
Well, the irony is that the material reality, which should be the atheist focus in my estimation, the material reality is he objectively would not have his prominence or success because the social base came from the church. But the rest of it is just pure speculation. It's like, okay, that's sounds like a compliment, but it doesn't mean shit. The guy that we had in this world was a Christian.
The other thing we should say about Judeo-Christian values as a term is it's just a transparently bigoted propaganda term, because you could have just said Abrahamic, but they want to exclude Muslims.
That's the tell. That's right. That's right. All right, which one do you want to go for first here?
We can either do Trump about the border, Tucker on healthcare.
Let's do Tucker on healthcare. Tucker Carlson has been taking a victory lap. He's clever. He's cynical. This isn't a hypocrisy point, actually. This is a raw fact we need to argue and center point. This guy is the main anchor on what is functionally state media. And I'm telling you, it's true. Like, I haven't watched a lot of actual state media, but I remember like seeing state media in a place like Turkey, and it visually and stylistically cues Fox News. This is not a defense. I generally think most cable news is trash, okay? Fox News is in a distinct reality, and the Jane Mayer report was not something just to shrug off, because she filled in the dots on even a distinction between a far-right biased network versus an actual systemic pounding of not only a specific, for a political party, but at this point essentially an individual, a head of state. Tucker Carlson is the main anchor on the network that does that. And whatever, he toys around with leaving right-wing orthodoxy. And he's either doing it to directly, almost more than wink, to the worst forces in our society, who are also incidentally close with the White House. And of course, I mean the white nationalist crowd. Or to do the economic populism thing with no substantive follow-through. And if you believe him on the foreign policy stuff, where are all the blocks demanding that Trump stop interfering in Venezuela? And incidentally, where we're at it, what about Tucker on the Iran deal? I thought Tucker was fact-based and opposed unnecessary and stupid wars. Well, pulling out of the Iran deal is the most dangerous and dumb thing that's been done on that level in the last couple of years. So, Sure, screw CNN, but bear in mind that you're watching the primetime anchor of a arch propaganda functionally state television network saying this.
We have no idea what they've been showing over on CNN for the past 4 hours. We had to turn it off at 4 p.m. But if we had to guess, healthcare. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting word from our okay, I'm sorry. We have a news alert now. According to our producers who are monitoring the situation, both CNN and MSNBC are talking about, that's right, healthcare right now. Healthcare. Pelosi's orders. What does that tell you? It tells you where your news comes from. Democratic officials pick the topic and the storyline. Their servants in cable news dutifully repeat it to the word all day long. CNN is not a news outlet. It's a super PAC. It is running unregulated campaign ads 24 hours a day. Someone ought to call the FEC about it.
First of all, even on CNN, which does plenty of anti-Trump coverage, they also constantly have on far-right extreme pundits and hire former Trump officials. That's number one. Secondly, I get the point he's making. He's trying to do, we just had this Russia debacle, which, frankly, I agree it was a debacle more than some people. I also think you're radically overstating your case, and if you're so confident, why aren't you telling Mitch McConnell to release the full report? But that being said, I agreed. I actually agreed with you. I was like, yeah, all of this endless speculation and at some points just straight up fantasy about Russia is distracting from, stories like the Trump administration embracing a lawsuit with no legal basis whose singular attempt is to cause premature deaths of thousands of Americans and kick $20 million off of their health insurance. I'm glad. This should be a celebration that MSNBC and CNN are actually finally talking about something like healthcare. Oh, and incidentally, isn't this the same network that, putting aside how much I just don't, I agree, who cares? But isn't this the same network that actually literally sat on the Stormy Daniels story during the election cycle purely because it could hurt a presidential candidate? Maybe the FEC should look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I
fuck out of here.
I generally agree with the media critique of the Russia story, but I will say what Fox News does every single night does more damage to this country than I think David Corn or Rachel Maddow has. I'm
going to say, and I say that as a vehement critic of a David Corn and a Rachel Maddow, but you know what? Yes, that is a truism. Winnipeg Greg, I just want to thank Matt for respecting Canada. Michael, do better. What does you respect Canada?
I just said I respect them because you guys were dismissing their concerns. I'm like, I hear you, Canada.
That's because you like snow.
Yeah, and I mean fresh water. I'm preparing for the freshwater wars, frankly.
Ooh, we should do more Canada coverage. That's actually a good point. Waterboat from Kashmir. Two serious questions. If a majority of Jewish Americans wouldn't support a far-right organization like AIPAC, why would Chuck and Nancy attend, even though the presidential candidates are not? Nancy Pelosi had come out and said she didn't think Nancy Pelosi had come out and said she didn't think Ilhan Omar is anti-Semitic when the resolution was changed to include all forms of hate. Why do you think that she insinuated Ilhan Omar said something anti-Semitic at AIPAC? I can't square these two circles.
Well, I would just say this is how politics is typically done. You talk out of both sides of your mouth to different audiences. The only difference now is that we have things like social media, and it's much easier to see it.
Yes.
I mean, she has, to use a phrase, dual loyalty to this, because I don't think Nancy Pelosi necessarily hates Ilhan Omar. I think she is also probably more concerned with the historical alliance they have with.
I'm sorry to say, guys, but Haim Sabin, I believe his name is.
Yeah.
This guy who made a fortune off of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. He is one of the most important Democratic Party donors in the country, and he has said Israel is his issue. So, I know that when Ilhan Omar says, this, and that there's supposed to be a magical protective umbrella and the laws of money and physics and politics that apply to every single interest group on the planet can't apply to people advocating for a far-right policy in Israel. But in terms of reality, it does. And there's still a huge donor base for this. I also think that I think it's really important to hammer that stat because it's true, but I still think with some older Jewish voters, even if they don't like Netanyahu and oppose the occupation, they're still not going to be quite comfortable yet with completely exiting that consensus. And then I think, like, you know, and particularly like Schumer represents New York. And New York, I mean, you look at Bill de Blasio. I mean, he bends over backwards. I mean, this guy is supposed to be Mr. Woke. His policies on Israel are, you know, to the insane, far extreme racist right. So these contradictions are in terms of donors, funder networks, and also I think in some cases, as in Schumer, I think if it's kind of amazing because Schumer is like such a, you know, transactional hack, but I think he's genuinely got some extremely far right convictions on Israel. Herb Munculus, still haven't heard you guys talk about Brianna Joy Gray being hired by Bernie. She's been great on TMBS. Well, I talked about it. Congratulate her on TMBS. It's awesome. It's
cool.
It's a great hire. She'll do a great job and great.
Everyone pulling their hair out of it was nerds.
Yes.
Who did?
You'd be surprised at how many people. I mean, people were more obsessed about David Sirota.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. That's what I saw.
What's amazing about like the Sirota thing, and I don't even bother to follow. It's just like because people
pointless.
it's nerd, disingenuous nonsense. But it's like you know, these other candidates have people working for them who've done like AstroTurf work for all sorts of corporate, like just.
I don't know, man. Did you hear the coal miners in West Virginia talking about Sirota the last time around?
That's what they said. So I could tell you what, I like the idea of rebuilding the industrial belt, but when you order a guy like David Sirota, who in a 3-week span went from writing a column for The Guardian, which I read regularly on my tablet, that said that, you know, the Obama era was a missed opportunity for structural reform, which has always been the attitude of this beer hall. And then 3 weeks later, you go and you work for Bernie Sanders. I don't know. I just got to question that.
Look, fair enough.
Goes to the top of my list.
Fair enough that basically the entirety of David Sirota's output was basically a bias towards Bernie Sanders. That he'd actually officially joined the campaign. I mean, what does that mean for the ethics in journalism?
I mean, when you think about the idea that, I mean, and granted, journalists go and double dip and they cover an industry and then become PR hacks for it, and MSNBC clearly doesn't give the guy a fair shake, and I acknowledge all of that. But that being said, there's something just super disturbing about a guy who's transparently pro-Bernie ending up and going and work for him. Raises some serious ethical questions.
Yeah, say what you will about Zerlina Maxwell, but Sirota, that's where I draw the line.
That's where I draw the line.
Right after my Lyft driver asked me about the Mueller report, he's like, by the way, more importantly, what do you think's going to happen from all this David Sirota stuff?
Yeah, it's just like, it's like, look, I'm not saying that I'm not upset that I can't afford my health care and my kid can't get a job out of college and I'm driving a Lyft to keep the mortgage on our house, but why did David Sirota write a column critical of Kamala Harris's banking policies and then take a speech writing job with Bernie? I mean, what the fuck?
I mean, the most amazing thing about that story was it an Atlantic writer?
Yeah. He's obviously just some conduit for Oppo, like dumb Oppo research on Bernie.
Literally like crudely photoshopping a timestamp out just because it disproves or like may de-emphasizes the point you're trying to make. And then nothing happened, as far as I know.
Nothing happened. Nothing. I mean...
What does this mean about ethics and journalism is what I want to know.
That's what I want to know. I mean, you know, it's insane. And all you can do is just like put I'm not calling, well, I think maybe actually the Atlanta cases, but I'm just saying, look, just put out a general call. All these places are going to be biased against Bernie, but like, can you at least like register to MSNBC like, hey, you know, like you had a pundit on who just like said a straight up falsehood about him. I'd at least like that registered.
Yeah, or at least like when you put up graphics of those vying for the nomination, put his photo in it.
Yeah, that's also, you know, it's usually best practices to have the lead declared candidate's photo up there with like unprecedented crowds and grassroots
with like
fundraising.
Delaney.
Yeah, no, it's just a thought. Just a thought. A brother from Brooklyn. How much of a thought is Pete? How much of a threat? How much of a threat is Pete Buttigieg?
Boot edge.
Boot edge.
Buttigieg.
We call his fans the boot edge lords.
How big a threat is he to Bernie? Although I honestly think homophobia prevent him from beating Trump, he could be a dark horse for the nomination. Well, I would be concerned. I mean, actually, I hope not, but you could be right about the homophobia. I mean, no, I don't. That's the bottom line. I don't.
He needs to learn a few more languages.
I just don't. I think he is very. It's one of these like sort of truisms that the right just totally abuses and misuses. But like there is a liberal credentialist infatuation with things that normal people don't share. So like, he speaks Norwegian. That's great. But where is the clear policy on everybody getting health care? I've actually been pretty sympathetic to him. I found what he said about Chelsea Manning to be like disturbing.
It's like that's
wrong.
That's the one area he's, as far as I've noticed, he's consistently wishy or not good on is foreign policy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he had that great line about Bolton shouldn't be in the Situation Room, but I think it's it's all on like a I'm a soldier, I know how to do this stuff.
Yeah.
And so outside, but yeah. What are you gonna say, Brendan?
I was just gonna say, like, if we're picking, more of a moderate leaning into the moment, I would pick him. I mean, he's a former McKinsey consultant, so there's like
that's a huge strike against him as well.
He's got a checkered past, but like, who knows if he can lean into the moment enough to like actually affect some change or run deep into the primary. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
I'm initially
skeptical. I wouldn't worry about him peeling off progressive votes early, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm
if I was a Beto fan, I'd be worried about Buttigieg.
Yeah, I think that they are swimming in some pretty similar water there. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. It's like, if you're on the left, Bernie Sanders. I'm sorry. Like, and then not because, I mean, nobody is perfect. And there's valid criticisms of everybody. Blah, 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 blah. But like, if you look at the scale of problems we have and the fact that we might have a very small period of time to dig out of them on both a level of urgent human need as well as widespread structural and ecological problems, if you have a left diagnosis of the world, there is one candidate who is by far in his own class of representing those issues. And I'm sorry if you think he's grouchy. Sorry if you didn't, if dozens of campaign events for Hillary Clinton wasn't enough. I'm sorry, frankly, that, look, if Elizabeth Warren ran in 2016, I think, A, she might have actually won, and B, she would be in the position. And frankly, I think Bernie wouldn't run. I think Bernie's a mission-driven guy. But he's the one. He's the one with the base, and most importantly, he's the one with the critical power analysis of how this actually gets done. And actually, I want to play this ad. I think this is good framing here. This is a new Bernie spot. Medicare for All, I actually thought Medicare for All was going to be kind of off the table in the Democratic primary because I thought that was the issue that enough work had been done on, and all of the centrists and moderates like Harris and Gillibrand and Booker had signed on to it. But already, and even with Elizabeth Warren, there's just this unbelievable equivocation about it, which I don't understand. Now, lowering the Medicare age and some of these other ideas are very nice reforms. But I can tell you, even just frankly as a matter of self-interest, to be blunt, I am tired of as someone who's spent a vast majority of my adult life without insurance and experienced how horrifying that is on a daily basis. And also now as somebody who is a small business owner who overpays on a crap product, I'm done with this. And I'm done with a system where growing up in poverty, a family like my family, you couldn't necessarily get medicines you needed all the time, where, there's major impediments. And the Jayapal and Sanders bill, that's how you do it. Jamila Mishner on my show, she recently said, I forget, because we're talking about how to balance all of these demands of universal programs that we absolutely need with the specific legacies of racism that are in the DNA of the country. And I remember one of her takeaway points. She's like, look, if I'm paraphrasing her, but something effective. If we pass Jayapal or Sanders bills, become law, the types of problems we're dealing with are, you've gone from you're about to die in an emergency to how do I most effectively want to spend my golden years, right? Like, it's an imperfect analogy, but like, yes, we have to iron out home care rules. We have to figure out the extent of eye care. We have to make sure that the legacies of racism and classism in states are eliminated and destroyed as we eliminate Medicare, as we deliver Medicare for every single person residing in the United States, period. But to do that is already in a completely different reality and benefit for people here, period. And even like a nice little reform is still not going to take that leap. We need it. It's a basic moral question. And it's also a basic freedom question, which is why I like this ad that they put together with Ro Khanna for Bernie Sanders on Medicare for All.
Medicare for All is about freedom. It's about the freedom of an entrepreneur to dream about starting a business without fearing that her family will lose health care. It's about the freedom of an employee to change jobs without worrying about losing his doctor. It's about the freedom of a mother to take care of her sick child without fearing that the hospital bills will pile up.
The goal of healthcare, you want to hear a radical idea? Another one? Goal of healthcare must be to provide quality care to all people, not to make billions in profits for the insurance companies and their CEOs.
Here's what Medicare for All does. It reduces the cost so that families don't have to pay $6,000 premiums every year that they can't afford, and it saves our country money by getting rid of the excessive insurance profits and the big pharma monopolies.
Today, we say to the private health insurance companies, whether they like it or not, the United States is going to join every other major country on earth and guarantee health care to all people as a right.
Every time the people come and say Medicare for All is not affordable, here's what we need to point out. I want us to ask them, how is the current system affordable with its $59 million payout to Aetna CEO, its $350 billion giveaway to Big Pharma, and its $49 trillion cost to the American economy? The current system is not affordable. Medicare for All is about freedom.
Guys, we need to get this. This needs to be elected president.
No pivot into technocracy mode. Like, oh, there's lots of ways we can do it. Bullshit. Not the time for it. Warren, specifically. The other ones are going to do that. But Elizabeth Warren needs to get on the right page.
Elizabeth Warren, right. Precisely because Elizabeth Warren is significantly better than the other ones. The other ones will do it because, frankly, they're just compromised by donations and ideology and lack of commitment, in my opinion, to be blunt. But we need this. Period. And we need someone who understands that, frankly, ironically, even those little technocratic interventions would still require... Do you realize that the ACA, which is the center-right, corporate-friendly version of doing this, still took a Herculean political effort to achieve?
Budget reconciliation?
Budget reconciliation. They lost the Senate over it. And the only equation that was missing was maybe if you delivered a plan that was clear and no bullshit and not so convoluted, and just said, look, we're going to get rid of this parasite industry and we're going to give everybody health care, then you might have mobilized millions of people to go out there and do the work. That is what you need, a leadership that understands. Period. You're calling from an 845 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, it's Jeffrey from Rockland County.
Hey, Jeffrey, what's on your mind?
So mine. I wanted to talk about a couple of days ago. I remember listening to the show, and there was a caller that came in talking about how the very basic, almost, new atheist type of argumentation that I heard. Like Muhammad was such a bad guy, he killed 10,000 people and enslaved the women and whatnot. I remember. I don't know if you remember that call. I did.
I think it was in the middle. I came back from was this the call that during my dentist appointment that I came back for?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, and I had to be like, you know what the best part of the Quran is? We said we got 20 minutes. Convert. Get the chop. Allahu Akbar.
Yeah.
Okay. That was fun.
But yeah,
that was the best part of that call. If I dare say
one
so.
of my biggest issue for that was that it is such like when the guy was speaking about it, it's so reductionist in history. Like when he said that, I was just like, bro, by that logic, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, a whole bunch of people were very bad guys by that logic because they did the exact same thing. I mean, what Muhammad did, if you talk to an actual real historian, no matter how brutal it was the standard practice of many ancient societies for many political purposes. That is how it was done.
Well, you know what I think to me, the more interesting response is, and look, I'll just say this. Here's my bottom line, frankly.
Yeah.
I think you can criticize Islam and the Quran if you want to criticize religion. And if you want to actually have if you have an actual argument about how it affects politics, but then you'd already be in a different place because then, an example, you'd be talking about Wahhabism or Salafism. You wouldn't just talk about Islam. And I doubt these people even know these distinctions. But
they don't.
The other point is like, look, like the other point is like the bottom line is like, this is a important figure to people. And like, if you can catch, I don't understand people like, one distinction would be to say, yeah, I don't care what your religion is. We're not going to support you in, keeping girls from going to school. Yes, that's an objective.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, if you feel an incredible, overwhelming personal need to prove that the founder of somebody else's faith is an asshole, I actually just object to that. Honestly, I agree on historical grounds, which I'll get to in a second. But I'm also just civically, I'm sorry. That's useless, and you're just being a dick. And there's a reason, almost certainly, why you're exclusively fixated on Muhammad. Now, the other interesting angle on this, I'd recommend everybody read a book by Robert Wright called The Evolution of God. And what he tracks, it's funny because unlike the atheists, he actually, or the new atheists, it's a very materialistic-driven book. And what he actually documents is that part of the reason, and he talks about the three main Abrahamic faiths, but we'll go with Islam for this. There are genuinely contradictory passages, right? And so when you get these debates, like you'll have people who will say like, no, like Muhammad said to take one innocent life is the equivalent to like, killing all of humanity. And then the atheist will respond with some, really bloodthirsty passage. And the answer, which makes a lot of sense to me, is, and his conduct too, because he responded very differently to different situations. And also, again, he did other things that were very progressive in that context. He actually was disrupting slave networks and things like that, but was basically just like, what were the politics of the alliances he was building? So when he when he had diplomatic relationships with other tribes, that's where the verses where it's like, all of the religions have different prophets. We respect all of them. Like there's lines in there like that, and that reflects like he's got a peace treaty going. And then the lines like
it's the same with
It's the same with all religions to some degree or another. They're all even to the extent we can determine. It's hard, obviously, with ancient texts and limited resources. But like everywhere else, the politics and the conditions influence these things. So Robert Wright's whole argument.
It's the same with the rise of Christianity too. There was a lot of things going on at the time. Particularly, like a lot of like historians would pinpoint like Christianity's rise during the time of the Roman occupation and the Jewish revolts that were going on.
Yes. Well, that's a really
from
interesting.
ancient Palestine. Yeah.
That's a super interesting history. Like, I don't know enough about it, but I've read. Like, how does, one way of understanding Jesus is that he's basically like a radical rabbi who is opposing like the rot in the religious establishment and the Roman occupation. And then Paul comes along, and Paul's actually like, we might have like a global brand here that works for the whole Roman Empire. and the thing gets
Yeah,
you know. So yeah. And what's amazing is like the only people that seem to not want to talk about religion in a way that is both respectful civically, but also is willing to explore the historical and political questions are either religious fanatics or new atheists. Everybody else seems to be able to be like, yeah, including, by the way, members of the faiths, in my experience, who aren't fanatics.
Yeah, from my experience too. I mean, it's the same thing I had issues with. I mean, my brother's an academic in Israel, and he brings up stories about like how. I mean, I remember I brought up to him like, what do you think of Sam Harris? And my brother flat out with no indication said he's an idiot.
Yep.
I don't listen to like anything he says.
All of a sudden, we can't talk
people,
about idiots anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's all I wanted to say. Really.
Thanks for the call, man. Much appreciated.
No problem.
You know how Sam Harris, like, because for this book, I have to go back to the New Atheist stuff to see the transition of how that turned into IDW in some respects. And all of the obvious massive problems with Hitchens and the fact that Dawkins is a great evolutionary biologist, but basically a crank and an asshole.
He's been on one lately, too.
I'm sure. And Dennett's just like a boring whatever. But a snooze fest, but a serious academic. And you look at this four people and you're like, okay, an asshole but a legendary evolutionary biologist, an asshole but one of the most important reporters and bon vivants of the 80s and 90s, and then like Daniel Dennett, who's a snooze fest but a serious academic, and then like this guy in his 30s who, after like doing a bunch of meditations and retreats and stuff for 10 years, writes like a Atheism is Good, Muslims Are Bad book. How did he get in that group? And my speculation, and it's pure speculation, is like, guys, if I can be in the video, we can use my mom's house. She wrote the Golden Girls. Open bar if I can be in the video. You're calling from a 937 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Michael Brooks, I finally made contact you on the digitosphere. This is Boris Epstein calling you from beautiful Sao Paulo, Brazil.
If this is Boris Epstein,
Sinclair
wouldn't you have something to say to Matt more so than me? Because Matt's been your arch nemesis from the show.
I have a problem with your foreign policy takes, Michael, but Matlack has fake degree.
Whoa.
Sinclair Media let me out of my quarters where I'm surrounded by televisions to correspond to you and your show and defend Bolsonaro agenda from regressive left.
So you're like
This
Dave
is
Rubin. You can't pronounce Bolsonaro's name, huh?
I admire Dave Rubin quite a bit. Michael Brooks, this is bottom line. When Lula hand out Obama phones and pee on other man in street, it hurt us and all our children who pee on. Just like liberal icon our Kelly. Now I am in Caracas, Venezuela.
He said, would you say liberal icon our Kelly?
Yes,
That's
yes.
good. Okay.
Where is problem? This is bottom line, Michael. I am in Caracas, Venezuela, where Maduro starved his people. I report to you from here on ground. This is bottom line. First lady meet with Trump's deal done. Beautiful.
The only thing is, I thought it was this is line that is bottom. I thought was Boris's thing.
Michael, you're like Seth Meyers. You commit several episodes to me, and I have reply rate. Sinclair put roof over my head and fill my cores with TVs is quite bright. James scared me with talk of anarcho-communism. I must jump.
Thank you for the call. That was pretty good, Boris. That was solid. So Ben Shapiro is having a little bit of a spasm. And this is a very much, I don't like that quote, actually. My answer is my feelings don't care about your facts. Because
or facts don't matter, as
yeah, facts don't matter.
Which Oscar Wilde was another guy.
Yeah,
who was a facts don't matter.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde was a super facts don't matter guy, which is why he was such a great writer.
So the Economist, and they've actually deleted the tweet.
Yes.
But the
Do
original
we have this up on the screen?
Yeah, you want to put that up, Brendan? It says, inside the mind of Ben Shapiro, the alt-right sage without the rage. I haven't actually looked at the piece yet, but Then Ben Shapiro says, The Economist, this is a vile lie. Not only am I not alt-right, I am probably their leading critic on the right. I was the #1 target of their hate in 2016, according to ADL data. I demand a retraction. And
leading source of their hate, huh?
Yeah. No, he was the #1 target of their hate. I mean, if we want to get into data, he was also the #1 guy that the one of the mosque shootings, I think the one, I forget.
Mosque shooting in Canada. He was one of his top Twitter search
Big
terms.
Shapiro fan. But the other thing that's
Don't
interesting...
get in your bag, Ben. That's a fact.
Yeah, it's just a fact. We're just talking about facts here.
Yes.
This is a day after it was revealed that the Christchurch killer was donating to identitarian movements in Austria, sort of connected to... Brittany Pettibone is one of the women who was on it.
Right.
There she is with Stefan Molyneux. Brittany Pettibone is connected to Martin Sellner, one of the leaders of it.
And he is an Austrian identitarian, and they actually raided his house. So I don't know the state of things now, but he was actually, there was at least some form of initial investigation in
I think
Austria
that what's
about
confirmed
this.
so far is the shooter donated money to them.
Right. No, he wasn't arrested or anything, but I believe they explored,
Okay,
they were looking for things. Yeah.
But if you look through, this is a nice thread by Becca Lewis here, who just connects all the different people who've been platforming this. And wouldn't you know that Lauren Southern, who's also connected there, she is with Dave Rubin and some other guy. I don't actually know who that is.
It looks like a Dave Rubin parody, whoever that guy is, but that's fine.
But look what we have here. The Daily Wire has actually hosted Southern several times. Andrew Clavin, another show host on the network, has also had her on, as has the head of the network, Ben Shapiro. She seems to be a favorite there. There's Ben Shapiro discussing with Lauren Southern, is America on the verge of a mental breakdown? I wonder which people they discovered there. So
maybe it was an interview where Ben talked about how dangerous it was to promote xenophobia and racism. But I'm guessing not.
Or took her to task very hardly.
Or took her to task very hard.
We're only going to have you on 6 other times on my network after I take you to task here. And The Economist did eventually backtrack and said, we apologize. They call him like a conservative or something now.
Oh, God.
But Ben Shapiro's like, in other words, if you label me alt-right, fuck you and the horse you rode in on. Jesus Nice says Herb.
Yes, I'm really glad to see a revival in the word Herb.
Yeah, I actually don't think The Economist was wrong to call Ben Shapiro alt-right. I mean, you could technically say maybe he's alt-light because he's a conduit to the alt-right.
Yeah.
But I think we're splitting hairs there after, a number of actual killings, racist killers have cited this sort of
Do you also
milieu
remember
as
his main spin when he quit Breitbart over Trump? And I remember he hated Bannon, and God knows
that's the thing. He's like, I wrote this thing against Bannon.
And who knows what the real beef was? I mean, maybe it was sincere, but I don't take anything that any of these people say at face value. But a big part of his spin was Andrew Breitbart would never do this. Andrew Breitbart, the founder of Breitbart News, the spreader of the Acorn Lie, a guy who was in the heart of every racist conspiracy about Obama. I guess with the exception, I think he was careful about not getting too involved in birtherism, but I'm sure it was a conduit for it on that site. Andrew Breitbart, who's just a pure extremist media hustler, he would have, after a career of lies about Obama and socialist conspiracy theories, would have been like, oh, a tabloid figure running a troll campaign for president with money at stake. Yeah, this is the time where I'd have a conscience. All that would happen I am quite sure that if Andrew Breitbart was still alive, Ben Shapiro probably would be working for him and wouldn't have had his fake anti-Trump phase. This is the mosque shooter info.
Yeah, the list of Twitter profiles visited by Quebec City mosque killer in weeks leading up to the shooting. It's interesting. I don't know how they tell how many times he visited there. Maybe it is search or internet history. But right at the top of the list, Ben Shapiro, editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire, animate tour of the Ben Shapiro Show. That's weird. Also, John Nolte up there, author Breitbart, author of the Daily Wire of Ben Shapiro. Tucker Carlson, Fox News, founder of the Daily Caller. So
this guy was really intellectually curious.
Yeah, I mean, he also goes, more explicit racist as Richard Spencer there. But, yeah.
That's actually funny because, in a way, that's actually a pretty good... That's sort of how it works, right?
Like you
get a little Shapiro, a little Carlson.
That's your main...
And then we start moving, then we get some... I mean, it's jumbled up, but I actually like that trajectory. Shapiro, Carlson, Spencer, Duke. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how the pipeline in theory works, right? Like you have these bigger media figures, and then you have this, we're the intellectual dark web. Well, what ideas are really hidden here? I guess we're going to have to, follow all these different people you've had on your shows, right? You're exposing me to Lauren Southern because presumably she's part of this intellectual dark web as well. These ideas were just being hidden from, like maybe ideas about Muslim birth rates and that sort of thing.
Right.
Maybe. And I mean, this is it's so obvious, and I think more stuff is only going to happen or is going to out because
be disclosed
of the jerk encirclement.
All right, let's do one more piece of sound. I want to play this, and then we'll end soon. But are we? I'm gonna break the third wall here. Are we tight? No. Oh, okay, cool. Oh. What is Gab? It's the intellectual dark web. That's exactly what it is.
Oh, is that on the list?
No, it literally is. Gab is this is where we go to be.
Oh, right.
Yes, exactly. Right. I want to play this appeal from the United Nations from Mozambique. There isn't much to add to this, but I just want to keep this in our awareness at least. There's a cholera outbreak there now. Several hundred people have died. I know that there's some South African troop presence. And this is a report that was done on, I believe it's the South African Broadcasting Corporation. So that's South African public television through the UN, just to center Mozambique for a little bit here.
In New York has launched a $282 million appeal for Mozambique. Similar appeals for Zimbabwe and Malawi will follow in the coming days. The funding is only for the next 3 months, with the big focus on hygiene, sanitation, health and education for children. Show and Bryce Peace compiled this report.
As the death toll now reaches beyond 750 across the worst affected countries, the immediate concern is preventing an outbreak of disease. And with thousands either huddled in camps or schools, humanitarian workers are bracing for the spread of diseases like cholera or malaria.
Beira has been separated, so it's been an island. The airport is now working. Communications are back up. As of this weekend, there is running water, which will be extremely important, but we are very worried about disease.
What should we be learning from this?
We pressed these UN officials on what the long-term recovery and development requirements would be for one of the poorest regions of the world.
The future will have to be public and private, which is what was the basis of the Marshall Plan. And so, to Mark's point, as you're rethinking the economy, we have to try to make sure that these are knitted together in each country as best we can and encourage it.
With the need for the agrarian economies of the region to diversify faster in order to offset the extreme weather that will continue to be a common feature, with at least 500,000 hectares of agricultural land damaged in Mozambique alone.
How is Malawi and countries like it going to evolve the economy to be able to cope better with these kinds of problems?
The scale of devastation extraordinary, with entire communities, villages and cities having to be rebuilt once this phase of the humanitarian response is complete. Sherwin Bryceby's SABC News, New York.
So obviously, of course, there needs to be just immediate humanitarian delivery, but there's a lot of problems in the assumption of that report. So like as an example, we know that more money migrates off the continent than goes in because of tax theft and tax shelters and things like that. We also know that, yes, of course, places like Malawi and Mozambique need capacity building to adopt to climate change, but the notion that it's sort of on them when they are the least of contributors to the global climate crisis compared to obviously the United States or China for that matter. And in addition to that, the notion that this is a question of their own economic diversification is a profound misreading of all of the systems of exploitation in the global system that still operate on Africa and block not only economic diversification, but in fact, even the types of industrially productive and development moves that, as an example, China got to make. China got to break the Washington consensus and protect domestic industries and manage its growth because they were big enough to not be bullied by international organizations. Mozambique and Malawi are not. So we create the broader effects of a catastrophe like this. You're calling from a 210 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hi. Hi, Mike, Matt, and Brendan. This is Cody. How's it going?
Hey, Cody. What's going on? What's
from
on your
San
mind?
Antonio. Sorry.
Oh, from San Antonio. Welcome.
Yeah. Hey, I had a few thoughts about the Tuesday show, kind of like the other caller did. Let's see. I kind of hated. I know you showed up about halfway through on that one. But,
the Muslim call.
Well, I was going to get to that one. I was going to mention that that caller that was kind of up on Jamie a little bit. I just feel like there's a lot of I don't know how people receive this word, but I think there's a lot of anti-intellectualism going around with, like, you know, it was always especially that way with socialism. And, you know, obviously anarcho-communism is not really the way. I don't think it's conducive to American society. But, you know, I mentioned it one time to my dad. Jamie has actually kind of gone through to me just a little bit, you know. It's obviously not realistic, but I do say, you know, abolish the fucking state, like she once said. I would never mind that, but there's, you know, a lot of problems that's super utopian. So I just want to say, you know.
Yeah, go ahead. Make the point on it.
I was just going to say, I appreciate her saying more about the Overton window part, because I think if, you know, her being there on the Overton window, you know, if she wasn't there, I don't know if we would have had, you know, people like AOC come along and make socialism okay.
Cool.
That's basically the gist of my point.
Yeah, we keep pushing the dial. I didn't hear that call, to be honest, but I guess it sounded like there was some guy that literally was scared of.
It's a Cold War hangover.
Thanks for the call, man. Appreciate it. I mean, yeah, I would love to be in your psyche if Jamie talking about anarcho-communism is what makes you scared.
My only take on labels.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, my only take on labels.
What a relaxing life.
I think there's a lot of people you can reach with, I guess, sort of policies or approaches that are anarcho-communist. Then they'd go along with it much easier if you explained the sort of approach than say this is anarcho-communist, just because of the culture we have.
Yeah,
in this
of
country.
course. No doubt. You're calling from a 281 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, am I on?
Yes. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
My name's David. I'm calling from Austin, Texas, from the University of Texas, actually.
Oh, cool. What's on your mind?
Yeah, actually, I'm a big fan of all you guys.
Thanks,
but
man.
I do have a bit of a criticism with basically how you guys represent Beto. So I just want to quickly say that I am like, my top three people are Bernie, Liz Warren, and then Beto. But I don't necessarily think that y'all have been fair in your representations of Beto.
Can I have soundboard?
So, like, firstly, when you represent his voting record, you talk about how he's from a solidly blue voting district.
Mm-hmm.
But in my personal opinion, or my personal experience with other Texas Democrats, what they tend to be are people who say, yeah, I don't hate gays and minorities, but I like low taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever you're representing a Texas Democrat, you're going to vote right on certain economic issues. But I think that.
Well, wait, but
there's
I know
something you've said twice here, though.
Yeah,
is you've said the word Texas, not American or national politician. It blows it all out of the water.
Yeah, I mean, right. That's so honestly, like, that's the first point, to be honest. It's like, even if we took the most charitable interpretation, then great, run for Senate in Texas. You're not a leader of a party that's frankly, thankfully, finally moving in a better direction. So that's number one. And then number two, that's not strictly true, because we went back and we talked about when he was embracing Medicare and Social Security cuts, when that was politically fashionable. He was running against. He was running against
Social Security cuts.
Yes, he was. Absolutely.
in the clip you showed, he said he would consider it and that he would talk about it, but he never said
All
that
right,
he
That's
dude.
enough,
All
dude.
right,
Come
come
on.
on, man. You got to do better than that. Come
What
on.
do you mean? What do you mean? He literally said.
I mean what I
He
mean.
was running against a Democrat, and
He
he
was
said,
running
"You want
aga-
me in that room?"
He was running against a Democrat saying, this guy's fiscally irresponsible and you want me in the room because we're in a crisis, buying into the whole. And to be fair, this is maybe literally you're in college, so it's an age gap. At that time, the main drive in the country was austerity and cutting Social Security and Medicare. The Simpson-Bowles Commission put cuts on the table. They would have gone through, in fact. Obama and Biden offered them, and Democrats like Beto facilitated them. The only reason they didn't go through is because Republicans were so extreme they wouldn't take a win. No, dude, he was part of that. And honestly, saying I would think about it is worse than just embracing it. That's the equivocating bullshit. No, buddy, you got to do better than that. I understand he's a nice guy, and
I
that's
don't know.
fine.
Maybe
But
I'll admit that that's like probably the thing that I wanted to defend the least about Beto O'Rourke.
okay,
But-
well, all
because I
right.
don't
Well, what
really know
you
a lot
got,
about
what
he
you
was
have
running
is
on in
that
2012.
Texas Democrats are more conservative. Okay, cool. So run for Senate. And also that you don't really want to defend his
my problem
embracing
is
of
that-
terrible policies. All right, give me one more. One more.
Okay, well, I'm not necessarily sure exactly what. I just think that he has a really strong rating on LGBT issues, environmental issues.
I don't
and
know.
voting
Not
pro-worker.
environmental. Not environmental. Big
He has a-
question marks on
No,
environmental.
he has a 95% pro-environment rating.
So first of all, I'm sure you could look up and get 100% ratings on those kind of scores from other candidates, but those votes and those ratings in general, you got to be a little bit more like wary of, because they, as an example, like you could show a chart where two people vote 90, say it's a year. This is just bear with me for a second. Say it's the year where the invasion of Iraq happens. Because this happened with Clinton and Sanders, right? People would say like, hey, they voted together 95% of the time. And it's like, okay, where did they vote differently on these liberal lists? Oh, the most important historically defining issues of the time. The invasion of Iraq, the Patriot Act, the bankruptcy bill. So I know that Beto takes oil and gas money interests. And I know that even recently he tweeted about a balanced approach between oil and gas and renewable energies. I'm sure, again, for a Texas Democrat, he's better. But no, he's not good on this relative to where we need to go as a matter of science, and certainly even where the party is going. I mean, you think that Beto is going to be better than Sanders or Warren or Buttigieg or Gabbard or even a Booker on the environment? Think of just his political base from Texas.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely to the right of you, so maybe it's just because I essentially agree with Beto O'Rourke more than you do.
Okay.
But to be fair, he votes right on like certain deregulation issues, but he tends to vote left where it matters, in my opinion.
Well, so good. All right. So that's okay. So what we have here is, all right. So let's just run. And then as far as LGBTQ issues, everybody's on the same page with that. So we can just discard that. I'm sorry. Unless the only case you can make is if you want to say, I want the first openly gay president, then you could support Buttigieg or whatever.
And I do like Buttigieg.
I'm sure. Great. But let's just run this down, okay? And I think the last part is the most legitimate thing you've said, which is that you're more to the right on things like deregulation. I think that being to the right on deregulation, particularly of things like the fossil fuel industry, is basically like telling Sam's children to grow gills to swim in the future if you accept the science. So I think that is a ridiculous, actually very extreme and insane position. And then the other two things that you said are that, yes, Texas Democrats are more conservative, as is Beto, but that's not where the party is. Maybe it's where you are, but it's not where we want to go. And then the other part was that, yes, he had a terrible position on Social Security and Medicare, but he didn't have it 100%. Yeah, I mean, these are not good defenses.
Well, also I want to say he supports Medicare for America, which is essentially a public option.
Yeah, I
which
know.
I think would work
We need
better in
Medicare. Okay,
converting
so
Republicans.
that's cool. Well, no Republican's going to vote for any of these bills. So yeah, that's naive if you're thinking that there's a Republican buy-in on any of this. So all right, man, I get
don't
it. You have
necessarily
different
mean Republican senators. Okay, sorry.
No, it's fair enough. You have different politics. That's totally fine. You know what? I appreciate that you told me you want a center right Democrat instead of telling me that he's so inspiring. But I don't want a center-right Democrat. I want a progressive. That's what we need right now. So thanks for the
All right,
call.
thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you. All right. Final call of the day. You're calling from a 602 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Is this me?
Yes.
Hey, this is Kenny from Phoenix.
Hey, Kenny. What's going on? What's on your mind?
I may be digging up some old irrelevant stuff with a question. I guess I just want to say that I'm a big fan of you guys. I'm also a pretty big fan of Jimmy Dore. I guess I just kind of don't understand you guys' beef with him.
You literally just cut out. Are you actually telling? Wait. I'm sorry. Is this a joke?
No, this is real.
Okay, so you're a big fan of us, and you're a big fan of Jimmy Dore, and go. And you have no idea what the problem is?
I just want to understand, like, what your guys' beef is with him.
I mean, there are so many videos we've done on this.
Yeah, man, I don't know. Why don't you just watch the videos?
Yeah,
like,
Google,
honestly.
use YouTube.
Well, I don't know if your guys' views have updated or changed from those. I don't want to lead on.
Why would they
Probably
have?
not.
Why would they have?
Okay, well, I mean, the most recent video that I saw was Sam saying something about Jimmy poisoning the well when it comes to left ideology on certain ideas.
We still agree with that, yeah.
Yes. Correct.
I mean...
And you know how much it pains me to defend what Sam says here? But that... Okay.
I mean... Do you guys just apply that to Jimmy, or is that everybody? Because I mean, there's
actually, especially,
guys...
I would say actually, demonstrate. I mean, I don't know what you mean by everybody, but yes. If you go on the chat, in fact, I think that that's the only concern that I've had at times, which is like at some point we need to like, figure out where we want to, minimize that. But are you kidding me? Like everything from Pod Save America to Jimmy Dore, there's videos on this channel explaining why they're wrong.
Right, but I mean, you guys
kind
are
of our brands.
way closer to Jimmy than you guys are to Pod Save America. I mean, they're pretty center-left.
We're
compared
a
to
lot
Jimmy
farther
being
from Jimmy than a lot of people think we are.
That's
on
why
a
they
lot
make
of
the
things.
videos.
Yeah, dude,
particularly regarding strategy.
Yeah, I'm not, dude. I'm
like, I agree. He definitely goes into like the conspiracy theory side of things.
I don't
and that's
look.
not
Let
helpful
me just answer.
But he's still
let me
advocating
answer
and
for me.
promoting things like
Let me answer.
Medicare
I know.
for
I
all
know.
and supporting
Medicare
people
for
like
all.
Bernie
I know.
Sanders.
Well, actually, no. He's not supporting Bernie Sanders this time. But as
Right,
far,
he's
I think
supporting
he's
Tulsi, but-
So Tulsi's not
Okay, so,
right, there
I
you go.
mean-
So that's a very big difference there too. But let me just go from what my problem is, and I think literally Sam has explained his problem like dozens of times. So I guess you could call in again, but you could also just watch the videos. I'm honestly like, the conspiracy theory stuff triggers me less. I think it's stupid too, but whatever. My main problems are moralism as a substitute for economic analysis and politics. And I also have a really big problem. Let me finish.
I mean, moralism is easier for people to understand. I mean, it's
Okay,
easier
dude,
to jump
right,
into,
but
like,
that's
the
so
moral
there's
side of
poisoning the
things than it
well.
is to, like, the
There's
economy.
poisoning. Why is it that and Jimmy can say Michael is an asshole and I hate him, whatever, that's fine. That's his prerogative. But why, if you do a video about the Lava Jato team in Brazil that has been used, by the way, right up Jimmy's alley, like it's supported by the DOJ. It was something that Clinton and Obama were involved in. Kerry was involved in, at least passively. They all have horrible records on this. And it was weaponized to delegitimize the Workers' Party and make Lula a political prisoner, right? And I'm simplifying, but I don't have time to get into everything. He did one video where he and a couple of people sat around and were like, that's so cool, Lava Jato. And he hasn't even done one video going like, hey, you know what? I think that was a pretty big fuck up. Or even one video saying like, I hate Hillary Clinton and I have big policy problems with her, but I also maybe recognize that Trump poses unique and radical threats to certain communities, and somehow actually doing the hard and heavy lifting, because I've noticed that this unfortunately becomes like a talking point, and it's a shame, where it's like the two positions are either the MSNBC Pod Save America position, which is that, I'm simplifying, but it's like, oh, everything was great, and then Trump came along. Or the Jimmy Dore position, which is like, I'm the only one who says things were bad before Trump. It's bullshit. Like we do on this show, and I do on my show, endless. I mean, I do illicit histories. It's about every aspect of U.S. foreign policy and corporate power
since Trump got
in office, every week and every day. And also, you got to kind of deal with Trump because he's putting children in cages, and because he's destroying the environment, and because he is overtly winking at white supremacy. You kind of got to deal with those things. And I think that, honestly, like I don't keep up with Jimmy. I'm glad that he was opposing intervention in Venezuela. I think Jimmy's entertaining, and I wish he would have taken on the task of figuring out how to do that synthesis, but he didn't, and that sucks. And that's poisoning the well.
Right. I agree with part of that, but I mean,
dude, and
poisoning
also
the well, I feel like is a really strong statement. However, I mean, look at all the people that may or may not have come over to a lefter side of.
I don't know. I don't know what a lefter side is. I don't know what a lefter side is.
I look at his comments and the type of audience that
people that are like really like pro-Obama type politics that have listened to Jimmy, and based on like the really surface level emotional appeal.
If they have, I don't think he's. I don't.
I
could tell you almost certainly that people who really like President Obama in general are not swayed by that kind of argument. Like a lot of people who like President Obama are very personally invested in him. No, again, if you look at a lot of the comments and things around it, it's general, vague, populist rage. And vague populist rage is great if it's harnessed in the right way. If it's harnessed to draw false equivalencies, that's
I
bad.
guess that would be my
if it's
argument.
harnessed,
I feel like that's helpful compared to not saying anything.
Who isn't saying anything? Everybody's saying something.
Like these pro-Obama type.
But I critique those pro-Obama type people all the time. So I'm sorry, you don't have a beef with us.
I'm not saying that you guys aren't doing it. I'm just saying that
to
say that Jimmy's poisoning the entire view or the dynamic of what you guys are trying to peddle.
He is.
I think that's an overstatement and kind of unfair.
Well, that's your opinion. All right, that's
he is. I don't understand. Like, look, promoting, why all the positive segments on Tucker Carlson? And honestly, like, this doesn't, it gives me, for me,
I mean, you can agree with some of the things that Tucker is saying. I mean, he's obviously a terrible person, but
you
some of the
cannot.
things that he's saying.
No, this is what you don't understand. First of all, I do actually say things I agree with Tucker Carlson regularly, but you cannot cover Tucker Carlson as anything other than a prime conduit for mainstreaming and normalizing white nationalism. And if you don't see that, that's a strategic and
I
moral...
100% agree with that.
So then why doesn't Jimmy do that?
I haven't watched any of his Tucker Carlson segments, but if he's
all right, dude. All right, look, man. I think you're gonna just have to say that, like, even just on a level, like, in general, I'm pretty fucking tired of this topic, and I don't understand people's emotional need for us to like the same people you like. There's actual critiques, some of which are really important and go way beyond Jimmy. Some of which maybe are just like fucking, people call in and we fuck around and have a laugh. But if you can't understand the conspiracy stuff that is a problem, if you can't understand the Brazil coverage, if you can't understand not doing the heavy lifting of explaining that, yes, the whole political system is totally corrupt and rotted, and that includes Democrats and Republicans, and at the same time, on a relative level, there's hugely different implications for people's material lives now. It's less sexy, it's less exciting, but it actually is true. And also, the last thing I'll say, look, there's other people who've embraced, like as an example, voting for Jill Stein. Guess what? Cornel West gets to do that. Cornel West is one of America's greatest heroes, and in my mind, the finest intellectual we have. And he never draws moral equivalencies. And if he's done with it and fed up and wants to vote for Jill Stein, cool. But some of the rest of us haven't bought that currency. Glenn Greenwald, I still defend Glenn Greenwald overall because he lives in Brazil. He is actually under threat by a fascist government. He's done incredible reporting. And you know what? I think going on Tucker Carlson and doing victory laps is ridiculous.
Yeah, if you go on Tucker,
fundamentally wrong. The only reason you go on Tucker is to argue and try to destroy him.
Yeah.
And the only reason you play a clip of him on your show, in my estimation, is to either say, this is a major threat that we have to contend with and be strategic about, and the libs don't have an answer to, or to just straight up be like, here's Tucker Carlson being full of shit.
Yeah, and my bias is always, I don't think, even if you are unsure which of us is right about these sorts of disagreements, there's no light without heat, folks. Like, let political podcasts argue points. Like, we're not always going to kumbaya with each other. I don't think it's punching left. I think it's like being deliberate about these sorts of things.
And for what it's worth, if you go, and I don't really think it's that fruitful, but if you go back to the original drama, there is a debate. I had arguments with Jimmy, and it sucks. I was very friendly with Jimmy. I enjoyed doing stuff with him. And then, he just didn't, I would say, even in the summer 2016, like, yeah, Jimmy, I agree. Hillary's trash. What about the DACA? What about the Iran deal? No. What about the Supreme Court? No answers. He and Sam had a debate. History, frankly, has vindicated Sam. It's very weird on the merits of what they argued about, which is primarily the Supreme Court. So don't get that twisted. Let's be very specific. And the real breakdown actually happened because, frankly, Jimmy said he'd have Sam back on his show to debate, and they didn't have a follow-up debate. And I actually think overall it would have been great if we could have kept the lines of communication and argument open. And 99% of why we've talked about the guy in the last year is because people like you call. So, not all of your friends are also friends. Thanks for the call.
So
all right.
I'd say vote third party, no matter what, no matter where you are. I don't care if you're in a swing state.
And again, I am the one. If Jimmy came out and did a video on Lava Jato and how he got it wrong and what we need to do for Lula, awesome. And he could even trash Hillary while he did it. But I don't see it. I see a lot of and 30 seconds. I am more at this point on the other side. I've been agnostic, and now undoubtedly I am more on the Taibbi side of the equation of the Russia stuff as of now. Right? That's where I'm at. But I will not sure, I'll dunk on Rachel Maddow, but you do not co-celebrate with Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. Period. JJ Cool. Hey, Michael, do you think the American public will care about the unbelievable hypocrisy of selling nuclear technology to Saudi while ripping up the Iran deal? Very unlikely, but it is astonishing, and we will talk. I will definitely cover that more. Bags of Osho. Newest Quinnipiac poll has me worried over Democratic voters. By a margin of 52 to 39, voters prefer a candidate that works with Republicans rather than stands up to them. I see this as a result of painting Trump as something worse than the rest of the party. The whole Republican Party is evil to core, and voters need to recognize this and defeat them.
I think that
100%.
But I would say I'm pretty sure those numbers, like, those are Democrats getting better. Like they used to always be more, let's work with the Republicans, and now finally, like, those are dropping. So I think probably if you look at that longitudinally, that trend is going in the right direction.
I think you're actually exactly right. Guys, sorry, no more phone calls. The final IM of the day. Let's see. The final IM of the day goes to Disco Stew. I sincerely think Warren's AG proposal is great, but does she really think this is going to win? Ag proposal is great, but does she really think this is going to win over any farmers? Got news for you. The tariffs are killing them, and they still love Trump. Stop wasting your time trying to appeal to horrible people. Well, I mean, okay, dude. I don't know. There's plenty of farmers that did not vote for Trump. There's plenty of small organic farmers that are actually politically really radical, and incidentally, farms impact our entire food supply.
Yeah.
So,
and it could be the right move, even if it doesn't win you votes of farmers.
Yeah, it's the correct policy. You really cannot reduce everything to this cable news war about Trump. And as long as she's not, again, the distinction is so obvious. If you try to appeal to xenophobia or racism, then that is disgusting and wrong, and we reject it categorically. If you happen to deal with actual policies that negatively affect people that might vote badly, that's called doing your job as a leader and politician. So you have failed, to paraphrase Sam, or to directly quote Sam. We need that as a drop. You have failed. All right, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got
to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb, but finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid.